December 12, 1892, marked the beginning of the occupation, arriving with a hard freeze that locked the red clay roads of the Oklahoma Territory into rigid, unforgiving ruts. 6 riders emerged from the dense blackjack oak timber that lined the Cimarron River Valley, their horses stepping carefully over the uneven ground. The animals were large, American-bred quarter horses, chosen specifically for lung capacity and burst speed, their coats shaggy with winter growth and matted with the burrs of the underbrush. Steam rose in rhythmic plumes from their nostrils, instantly vanishing into the gray, static air. The men in the saddles rode with a posture that suggested long hours on the move, their spines curved against the biting wind, chins tucked into the collars of heavy canvas dusters and wool coats. They did not speak. The only sounds were the creak of leather saddle leather, the jingle of bit chains, and the sharp clatter of iron shoes striking frozen earth. Bill Doolin rode at the front of the column. He was a tall man, long-limbed and heavy-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of exposure to the high plains sun and wind. He scanned the perimeter of Engles as they approached, his eyes moving from the rooftops of the false-fronted buildings to the gaps between the structures. This was not a casual visit. Engles, a struggling settlement situated 10 miles east of Stillwater, sat isolated and economically depressed, bypassed by the major rail lines and ignored by territorial investors. To Doolin, these deficits were assets. He saw the town not as a failed commercial venture, but as a potential stronghold, a logistical hub located in the geographic dead zone between the jurisdictions of the federal courts in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Wichita, Kansas. The group turned onto Ash Street, the central artery of the town that ran north to south. The hooves of their mounts broke the silence of the afternoon, drawing the attention of the few residents braving the cold. A shopkeeper sweeping his boardwalk paused, his broom hovering inches above the wood as he recognized the riders. These were the remnants of the Dalton gang, reorganized and reinforced under Doolin's command following the catastrophic Coffeyville raid months earlier. Behind Doolin rode William Bill Dalton, George Bitter Creek Newcomb, Tulsa Jack Blake, Dynamite Dick Clifton, and the youthful, sharp-eyed Arkansas Tom Jones. They carried their weaponry openly. Winchester Model 1873 and 1876 rifles sat in leather scabbards positioned under their legs, the stocks worn smooth from handling. Colt single-action Army revolvers hung low on their hips, the heavy .45 caliber cartridges filling the loops of their gun belts. They halted in front of the Trig and Ransom Saloon, a wooden structure that served as the social nucleus of the town. The dismount was disciplined. No man left his horse until he had surveyed the immediate area. They tied the reins to the hitching rail, checking the knots to ensure a quick release if necessary. Doolin walked to the double doors and pushed them open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dim, heated by a cast-iron pot-belly stove that glowed orange in the center of the room. The scent of stale tobacco smoke, sawdust, and cheap whiskey hung in the air. The bartender, an older man named Bradley, froze as the 6 men filed in, their spurs chiming against the floorboards. The few patrons seated at the scattered tables kept their heads down, staring intently at their hands. Doolin approached the bar and placed a heavy canvas sack on the polished wood. The impact made a dull, solid thud. He loosened the drawstring and upended the sack, spilling a cascade of silver dollars and gold double eagles onto the counter. The coins clinked together, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. This was more hard currency than the establishment saw in a full month of legitimate trade. Doolin did not issue threats. He simply ordered whiskey for his men and stated that they would be staying in town for the foreseeable future. He slid a stack of silver toward Bradley. The payment was double the standard price for the drinks. The message was purely transactional. The gang offered economic revitalization in exchange for absolute discretion and unchecked access to the town's resources. Bradley swept the coins into his apron pocket and poured the drinks. The pact was sealed without a handshake. The logistics of the occupation began immediately. After the initial drink, the gang split up to secure the necessary infrastructure for a long-term stay. Bitter Creek Newcomb, who had worked as a cowboy in the surrounding area and maintained a relationship with a local woman named Rose Dunn, took charge of stabling the horses. He led the animals to the livery stable run by the Murray brothers. The stable was a critical asset. Newcomb inspected the stalls, checking for drafts and dampness. He ordered the Murray brothers to clear out their best stalls and lay down fresh straw thick enough to cushion the horses' joints. He paid them in advance for high-grade grain, specifically oats and cracked corn, avoiding the musty hay that could cause respiratory issues in the animals. A horse with the heaves was useless in a chase. Newcomb examined the hooves of each mount, instructing the smith to reshoe any horse that showed signs of loose nails or worn iron. The smith, intimidated by the outlaw's scrutiny, fired up his forge immediately, the bellows pumping air into the coals to heat the iron bars. While Newcomb secured the transport, Arkansas Tom Jones and Bill Dalton moved to secure housing. They approached the OK Hotel, a two-story frame building located on a strategic corner that offered commanding views of the approaches to the town. The proprietress, Mary Pierce, met them at the desk. She was a pragmatic woman who understood the precarious nature of frontier survival. Jones requested the rooms on the second floor facing the street. He did not care about the amenities, he cared about the elevation and the sight lines. From the upper windows, a rifleman could dominate Ash Street and the open ground beyond the buildings. Jones paid for the rooms for a month in advance, slapping gold coins onto the ledger. Mrs. Pierce took the money. The hotel was largely empty, the winter trade non-existent. The gang's patronage meant she could buy coal and food. She handed over the keys, effectively surrendering control of the town's primary defensive structure to the outlaws. By nightfall, the gang had embedded themselves into the fabric of Engles. They dined at the hotel, eating steaks cut from beef that Doolin had paid the local butcher to procure. The residents of Engles quickly realized that the outlaws were not there to loot the town, but to use it. The Doolin gang operated under a strict internal code regarding the locals. They paid for everything they consumed, often rounding up to the nearest dollar. In a cash-starved economy, this influx of silver created a rapid dependency. The general store owner, the liveryman, the hotelier, and the saloon keeper all saw their profits spike overnight. This financial dependency was the first wall of the fortress. A town that relied on the outlaws for its livelihood was unlikely to betray them to the marshals. The following days were spent fortifying their position, not with barricades but with intelligence and relationships. Doolin spent hours walking the perimeter of the town. He identified the drainage ditches that cut through the fields, noting which ones were deep enough to conceal a crawling man. He mapped the erratic course of the creeks, finding the crossover points where a horse could clear the banks. He noted the location of every fence line, gate, and outbuilding. He was building a tactical map in his mind, memorizing distances and angles. He identified a grove of trees to the southwest that offered a perfect fallback position, providing cover for a retreat into the deeper timber known as the Caves of the Bandits, a rugged area of ravines and limestone shelters a few miles from town. The gang also solidified their connection with the Dunn family. The Dunns lived on a farm just outside of town and served as a critical support network. B and Dal Dunn, the brothers of Newcomb's sweetheart Rose, were not official members of the gang, but they were sympathetic and willing accomplices. They provided fresh produce, eggs, and most importantly, information. The Dunns acted as an early warning system. Their farm was situated on a rise that overlooked the main road coming from Guthrie and Stillwater. Any large group of riders approaching from the west would be spotted by the Duns long before they reached the town limits. A prearranged signal, a rider sent at a gallop or a specific pattern of shots, would alert the gang in the saloon, giving them ample time to mount up and vanish into the scrub oak. As December turned to January 1893, the weather worsened, bringing heavy snow that drifted against the north walls of the buildings. The gang settled into a routine of maintenance and preparation. The saloon became their command post. They did not spend their days in a drunken stupor. Doolin enforced discipline. Alcohol was consumed but rarely to excess during daylight hours. Weapons maintenance was a daily ritual. The men sat at the tables, newspapers spread out to catch the oil and carbon as they disassembled their firearms. Arkansas. Tom was meticulous with his Winchester. He removed the side plates, wiping down the toggle links in the carrier block with an oily rag, inspecting the firing pin for any signs of stress fractures. A jammed rifle meant death. They polished the chambers of their revolvers to ensure the spent brass would eject smoothly. The smell of gun oil and solvent became a permanent scent in the saloon, mixing with the wood smoke. The local physician, Dr. J.H. Pickering, found himself drawn into the gang's orbit. Known to the locals as Pickles, the doctor was a man of skill but also of flexible morality. The gang required medical attention for the various ailments that plagued men living on the run. Saddle sores, infected cuts, dental abscesses, and respiratory infections from sleeping on damp ground. Pickering treated them in the back room of the drugstore or in their hotel rooms. He lanced boils, stitched minor wounds, and dispensed laudanum and quinine. Doolin paid him well, ensuring that the doctor prioritized the gang's health over other calls. Pickering's complicity added another layer to the fortress. The gang now had a dedicated medical corps. The psychological hold on the town tightened. The residents lived in a state of cognitive dissonance. These men were killers, fugitives with bounties on their heads, yet they bought candy for the children and tipped their hats to the women. Bitter Creek. Newcomb was particularly popular, his charm and local connections making him seem more like a wayward son than a violent criminal. He would sit on the porch of the general store, whittling a stick and telling stories to the local boys who looked at his pearl-handled revolvers with awe. This normalization of their presence was a strategic victory. The townspeople ceased to see the guns as threats to themselves. The weapons were perceived as tools of the trade, no different from a carpenter's hammer or a farmer's plow. The violence was abstract, something that happened elsewhere on trains and in banks, not in the quiet streets of Engles. However, the threat of violence was always present, lurking just beneath the surface of the polite exchanges. One afternoon in late January, a stranger rode into town, a man with the look of a drifter or perhaps a scout. He tied his horse at the rack and walked toward the saloon. Before his boot touched the boardwalk, Redbuck, the most volatile member of the gang, stepped out of the shadows of the alley. Redbuck did not speak. He simply cocked the hammer of his Winchester, the metallic click loud and distinct in the cold air. The stranger froze. Doolin emerged from the saloon a moment later, his hand resting casually on his holstered Colt. He looked the stranger over, his eyes cold and assessing. He asked the man his business in a tone that was low and devoid of aggression, but heavy with menace. The stranger stammered that he was looking for work. Doolin stared at him for 10 long seconds, letting the silence stretch until it was physically uncomfortable. Then he told the man there was no work in Engles and that the road west was clear. The stranger mounted his horse and left without looking back. The incident was a reminder to the town. The gang controlled the borders. They decided who entered and who left. February brought a slight thaw, turning the snow into a slurry of mud and ice. The gang used the slightly better weather to conduct riding drills in the timber east of town. They practiced high-speed maneuvers, galloping through the trees to test the agility of their horses and their own reflexes. They set up targets, glass bottles and tin cans on stumps, and practiced firing from the saddle. The cracks of the gunshots echoed off the hills, a daily reminder of the lethal power residing in the town. Doolin watched these sessions with a critical eye. He corrected their aim, adjusted their riding postures, and critiqued their reloading times. He was drilling them not just for robbery but for combat. He knew that Marshal Yvette Dumas Nix in Guthrie was assembling a force of deputy marshals who were aggressive and well-funded. The days of outrunning a lone sheriff were over. If the law came to Engles, they would come in force. The gang also stockpiled ammunition. They bought every box of 45 Colt and 44-40 Winchester cartridges the general store had in stock, and then ordered cases more. They kept crates of ammunition in the hotel rooms and behind the bar in the saloon. They were preparing for a siege. Doolin instructed the men to keep their bandoliers full and to carry extra boxes in their saddlebags at all times. The weight of the ammunition was significant, adding pounds to their load, but Doolin insisted. Running out of ammunition was a failure of planning he would not tolerate. By the end of winter, the transformation of Engles was complete. It was no longer a free settlement in the Oklahoma Territory. It was a feudal estate ruled by the Doolin gang. The legal authorities had no presence there. The mayor and the constable were figureheads who deferred to Doolin on all matters of substance. The economy was entirely sustained by the proceeds of crime. The citizens were complicit, bound by fear and financial necessity. The physical structures, the hotel, the saloon, the livery, had been co-opted into a defensive network. The surrounding terrain had been scouted and mapped. The escape routes were memorized, the horses were prime, and the weapons were ready. Bill Doolin stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon on the last day of February 1893. The wind had shifted, blowing from the south, carrying the first faint scent of warming earth. He watched the sunset turn the sky a bruised purple. He knew the spring would bring the trains back to full schedules, their express cars loaded with cash and bonds. It would also bring the marshals who would be able to travel the roads that had been impassable in winter. The sanctuary had served its purpose. The gang was rested, healed, and prepared. They had bought the town with blood money, and they had turned it into a fortress. Now, as the seasons changed, they would use that fortress as a springboard to unleash a campaign of robbery across the territory that would force the federal government to respond. The quiet winter in Engles was over. The violence was about to begin. June 11, 1893, unleashed a brutal heat wave across the southwestern plains of Kansas, baking the alkali soil until the ground formed a hard, cracked mosaic. The westbound express train of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, designated number 1, cut through this desolate landscape, its massive iron wheels grinding against the steel rails. Inside the cab, the heat was intense, amplified by the firebox that drove the pistons. Engineer L.H. Woodyard watched the heat shimmer rise off the tracks ahead, his hand resting on the throttle lever, unaware that the rail line near the Cimarron station had been compromised by a calculated ambush. Waiting in a dry, eroded ravine just west of the water tank were Bill Doolin, Bill Dalton, George Bitter Creek Newcomb, Tulsa Jack Blake, Dynamite Dick Clifton, and the ruthless Red Buck. They had ridden north from the Cherokee Outlet, crossing the state line not as drifting cowboys, but as a coordinated paramilitary unit. Their horses were tied deep within the brush, hidden from sight, while the men lay prone on the embankment, their Winchester rifles resting on the sun-bleached grass. As the locomotive began to decelerate for the necessary water stop, the routine mechanics of the railroad became the vulnerability the gang exploited. The screech of the brakes was still echoing across the prairie when Doolin and Dalton broke from their cover. They boarded the engine cab with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. Doolin jammed the muzzle of his .45 Colt into Woodyard's side, the cold steel pressing hard against the engineer's sweat-soaked shirt. He ordered the train held stationary. Simultaneously, Newcomb and Redbuck moved down the length of the passenger cars. They did not shout vague threats. They fired live rounds directly into the sides of the carriages and through the glass windows. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood created immediate chaos, forcing the passengers to dive for the floorboards, covering their heads as bullets ripped through the upholstery above them. The primary objective was the express car, a rolling fortress containing the wealth of the rail line. The messenger inside, hearing the initial volley, slammed the heavy sliding door shut and engaged the locks, arming himself with a shotgun. This resistance was expected. Dynamite Dick Clifton, a man whose expertise lay in the unstable chemistry of nitroglycerin, approached the door carrying a bundle of dynamite sticks bound together with friction tape. He wasted no time with negotiations. He wedged the charge against the locking mechanism and lit the short fuse, sprinting back to the shelter of the coal tender. The explosion was a sharp, concussive crack that disintegrated the heavy timber of the door and twisted the iron reinforcement bars into jagged scrap. The blast wave knocked the messenger backward, leaving him dazed, his ears ringing, unable to bring his weapon to bear. The outlaws swarmed into the smoke-filled car, the air thick with the acrid stench of explosive residue and pulverized wood. They stepped over the debris and the stunned messenger to reach the safes. The local safe, used for smaller transactions along the route, was already unlocked but held little value. The prize was the through safe, a heavy cast-iron box bolted to the floor containing the bulk shipment of currency and bonds. Clifton set a second, much larger charge directly on the safe door. He utilized a technique known as mud capping, using wet clay from the riverbank to tamp the explosive, directing the destructive force inward rather than letting it dissipate into the air. The second explosion rocked the entire train, blowing the roof off the express car and scattering burning debris for 50 yards in every direction. The safe door was sheared from its hinges and embedded in the opposite wall of the car. The gang scooped the contents into canvas sacks, grabbing handfuls of silver coins and bundles of banknotes. The haul totaled roughly $1,000 in silver and several thousand more in currency. It was a substantial weight. They retreated to the ravine, the heavy sacks swinging from their shoulders. As they mounted their horses, a few passengers who had retained their personal firearms began to fire sporadically from the broken windows. Redbuck turned in his saddle, raised his Winchester, and unleashed a suppressing volley that punched through the thin walls of the passenger cars. The resistance ceased instantly. The gang spurred their horses south, vanishing into the dust clouds, leaving the train crippled, the crew traumatized, and the railroad authorities humiliated. The Cimarron raid was the spark that ignited a firestorm across the region. It was not merely a theft. It was a direct challenge to the sovereignty of the state and the security of interstate commerce. The telegraph wires began to hum within minutes of the gang's departure. By the time the outlaws crossed back into the relative safety of the Oklahoma Territory, a massive, well-equipped posse was forming in Ford County, Kansas. Sheriff Chalk Beeson, a legendary figure in frontier law enforcement, assembled a group of deputies and civilian volunteers intent on pursuing the bandits across the jurisdictional line. They tracked the deep indentations of the gang's horses, following a trail marked by the occasional silver coin that had leaked from a torn sack, a glittering line leading straight toward the uncontrolled wilderness of the outlet. The pursuit evolved into a grueling test of endurance. The gang rode hard, pushing their animals to the point of collapse, swapping their tired mounts for fresh horses stolen from ranches along the route. They reached the rugged terrain near Fort Supply, but the posse remained close behind. On June 12th, The lawmen intercepted the rear guard of the gang at a location known as Slate Creek, close to the town of Ingalls. The terrain here was a nightmare for an attacking force: steep ravines, dense thickets of scrub oak, and unpredictable creek beds. It was ground Doolin knew intimately. The Battle of Slate Creek erupted with a ferocity that stunned the Kansas lawmen. The gang did not flee when the first shots were fired. Instead, they dismounted and took up defensive positions behind the natural limestone breastworks of the creek bed. They returned fire with a volume and accuracy that pinned the posse down in the open. The deputies found themselves trapped on the high ground, the sun beating down on their backs while the outlaws fired from the cool, dark shadows of the ravine. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt around the lawmen, whining off the rocks and snapping through the tall grass. 3 members of the posse were struck in the opening exchange. One deputy took a bullet through the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and dropping him hard. Another was grazed across the temple, blood filling his eyes and blinding him. Doolin directed the defense with the calm of a field commander. He called out targets and sectors of fire. When the posse attempted to flank the position on the left, Bill Dalton and Tulsa Jack unleashed a barrage of rapid fire from their Winchesters that forced the lawmen to dive for cover. When they tried to move on the right, Red Buck and Arkansas Tom cut them off with precise, single shots. The gang possessed superior weaponry and, thanks to their stockpiling efforts in Engles, an effectively unlimited supply of ammunition. They fired hundreds of rounds, creating a zone of death that the posse could not cross. The gunfight raged for hours, turning the quiet creek into a chaotic battlefield. As evening approached, the posse's tactical situation became critical. They were low on water, their horses were spooked and unmanageable, and they had wounded men who required urgent medical attention. The gang, sensing the wavering resolve of their pursuers, increased the intensity of their fire. Under the cover of the deepening twilight, Doolin ordered a withdrawal. The outlaws mounted their horses and slipped away down the creek bed, using the noise of a final thunderous volley to mask the sound of their retreat. They vanished into the labyrinth of the Cimarron breaks, leaving the battered posse with nothing but empty brass casings and bloody bandages. The Battle of Slate Creek was a decisive tactical victory. The gang had engaged a sworn force of lawmen in open combat and driven them from the field. The gang returned to Engles the following day, riding down Ash Street in broad daylight. Their horses were caked in dried sweat and mud, their saddlebags heavy with the Santa Fe silver. They did not sneak in. They paraded. The townspeople watched with a mixture of awe and terrified respect. These men had just fought a war and won. They went straight to the saloon where they cleaned their weapons and drank to their success. The victory at Slate Creek reinforced their feeling of invincibility. They believed they were untouchable within the sanctuary of the outlet, protected by the terrain and their own lethal proficiency. However, the events of June shifted the political landscape in Guthrie, the territorial capital. Marshal Evatt Dumas Nix sat in his office, his desk buried under a mountain of urgent telegrams. The governor of Kansas was demanding federal intervention. The executives of the Santa Fe Railroad were threatening to bypass the territory entirely if the government could not secure the lines. The Attorney General in Washington was demanding an explanation for how a group of bandits could rob a train and defeat a county posse with impunity. The pressure on Nix was crushing. He realized that the standard methods of law enforcement, individual deputies serving warrants or county sheriffs raising volunteer posses, were obsolete against an organization as well drilled and heavily armed as the Doolin gang. Nix called a war council with his top deputies. Among them were men who would become legends: Heck Thomas, Chris Madsen, and Bill Tilghman. These men, known as the Three Guardsmen, listened as Nix laid out the stark reality. The Doolin gang was not just a criminal enterprise. They were an insurgency occupying federal territory. They held the town of Engles as a fortified base. They had the support of the local population. They had outgunned a posse at Slate Creek. Nick stated clearly that the time for containment was over. They needed a strategy of extermination. The Marshals secured emergency funding from the Department of Justice to wage this campaign. He authorized the hiring of more deputies, specifically men with combat experience, distinct from the average peace officer. He purchased new wagons, better horses, and crates of modern ammunition. He ordered his deputies to map the area around Engles to identify every road, trail, and creek crossing. He began to build an intelligence network, paying informants to track the gang's movements. He needed to know exactly when the full gang was in town and when they were vulnerable. Back in the territory, the violence continued to escalate throughout the summer. Emboldened by their success at Cimarron and Slate Creek, the gang struck again. In July, they raided a store in Wharton, taking supplies and cash at gunpoint. In August, they targeted a bank in the town of Pawnee. The raid on Pawnee was particularly brutal and brazen. The gang rode into town screaming rebel yells, firing indiscriminately into the storefronts to clear the streets. Civilians threw themselves behind water troughs and rain barrels as bullets chewed up the wooden boardwalks. The outlaws blew the safe and rode out with thousands of dollars, leaving the citizens terrified and the local lawmen humiliated. Each robbery followed the same pattern: overwhelming force, speed, and a retreat to the impenetrable terrain around Engles. The sheer volume and violence of these crimes created a reign of terror across the Cherokee Outlet. Settlers were afraid to travel the roads. Merchants began to close their shops early, barring their doors before sunset. The mail carriers refused to deliver to certain areas without armed escorts. The Doolin gang had effectively paralyzed the region. They were the de facto rulers of the Cimarron Valley. In the saloon at Engles, Bitter Creek Newcomb bragged that no marshal would ever take them alive. He claimed that if the law ever came to Engles, they would stack the bodies of the deputies in the street like cordwood. The gang's arrogance led them to relax their guard. They spent more time in town, enjoying the fruits of their robberies. They held horse races on the flats outside of town, betting heavy bags of silver on the outcomes. They hosted dances in the hotel, paying the fiddlers with gold coins. Arkansas. Tom bought a new suit and spent his days courting a local girl sitting on the porch of the hotel in plain view. They believed the marshals were afraid to come after them. They believed the defeat of the posse at Slate Creek had taught the law a lesson in humility. But in Guthrie, Marshal Nix was finalizing his plans. He had identified the pattern. The gang always returned to Engles after a raid to rest and resupply. They felt safe there. Nix decided to turn that safety against them. He would not chase them across the open plains where they had the advantage of speed. He would hit them in their hive. He began to assemble a specific strike team, hand-picking deputies known for their coolness under fire. He selected John Hickson to lead the operation in the field. Hickson was a grim, taciturn man who understood that this would not be an arrest operation. It was a military assault. By late August 1893, the pieces were moving into place. The gang was gathered in Ingalls, resting after the summer raids. The larder at the hotel was full. The horses were grazing in the livery paddocks. The guns were cleaned and loaded. The outlaws slept soundly, secure in their fortress, unaware that the telegraph wires they had ignored were now coordinating their destruction. The reign of terror had brought them wealth and infamy, but it had also brought the full weight of the United States government down upon them. The political patience had evaporated. The machinery of justice, slow and grinding, was finally up to speed and aimed directly at the dusty streets of Engles. The atmosphere in the territory was heavy, charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. Farmers looked at the horizon, sensing a change. The Doolin gang had pushed too hard, too fast. They had embarrassed powerful men and frightened the public to the point where violence was the only acceptable solution. As August waned, the sun set earlier each day, casting longer shadows over the Cimarron. The stage was set for a collision that would shatter the quiet isolation of the town. The sanctuary bought in blood was about to demand a refund, and the currency would be the lives of the men who defended it. The Cimarron reign of terror was ending, and the Battle of Ingalls was about to begin. August 24th, 1893, found Marshal Evet Dumas Nix standing before a large, detailed territorial map pinned to the plaster wall of his office in Guthrie. The room was stifling, the air thick with the humidity of late summer and the smell of stale cigar smoke. Nix stared at the marked location of Engles, a small, insignificant dot surrounded by the vast, uncontrolled wilderness of the Cherokee Outlet. The intelligence reports stacked on his desk were unequivocal and frustrating. The Doolin gang was not merely hiding in the town, they had fortified it into a defensive stronghold. The disastrous defeat of the posse at Slate Creek had proven that a conventional approach by lawmen on horseback was a tactical suicide mission. The gang's network of scouts, particularly the Dunn brothers who lived on the outskirts, monitored every major trail leading into the area. Any group of armed riders approaching Engles would be spotted miles away, giving Bill Doolin ample time to either set a lethal ambush in the scrub oak or vanish into the ravines of the Cimarron. Nix understood that he could not outrun the gang's horses and he could not outshoot them in a fair fight on their chosen ground. He needed a method of insertion that bypassed the enemy's early warning system entirely. The solution lay in the chaotic social context of the moment. The Cherokee Strip land run was scheduled for mid-September, just weeks away. Thousands of prospective settlers, known as boomers, were already flooding into the territory, clogging the roads with wagons, buggies, and carts, jockeying for position along the borders of the unassigned lands. The roads were rivers of dust and canvas. A group of armed riders stood out as an anomaly, but a covered wagon, a prairie schooner that was the most common sight in the region. It was a ubiquitous, invisible object, a piece of mobile scenery that the eye naturally ignored. Nix formulated a plan that relied on this visual camouflage. He would not send a cavalry charge. He would send a Trojan horse. He ordered his field commander, Deputy John Hickson, to procure 2 large, sturdy covered wagons capable of concealing a heavy strike team and delivering them into the heart of the enemy camp without raising a single alarm. Hickson moved immediately to execute the directive, treating the acquisition of the vehicles with the same seriousness as the procurement of weapons. He went to the government corrals and selected 2 heavy farm wagons with high sides and reinforced axles. These were not light buckboards or spring wagons, they were freight wagons designed to haul heavy loads of grain or timber over rough ground. He inspected the wheels, ensuring the iron tires were tight against the felloes, and checked the hubs for cracks. He ordered the axles greased heavily to prevent any distinctive squeaking that might draw attention during a quiet approach. He secured heavy canvas sheets and the hickory bows needed to support them, creating a tunnel of fabric that would completely obscure the interior of the wagon beds from outside observation. The choice of draft animals was equally specific. They did not choose high-spirited cavalry mounts that might whinny or prance at the wrong moment. They selected plodding, reliable work teams, mules and draft horses that looked like they belonged to a poor dirt farmer moving his family west. The disguise had to be perfect down to the sweat stains on the harness leather. The recruitment of the posse was a secretive, compartmentalized process. Nix and Hickson knew that Engles had spies everywhere, perhaps even in Guthrie itself. They handpicked the deputies, approaching men known for their marksmanship, their ability to keep their mouths shut, and their willingness to engage in close-quarters combat. Among the selected were Leif Shadley, a relentless tracker with a reputation for fearlessness; Thomas Houston, a steady veteran who did not panic under fire; and Dick Speed, a man whose boyish face belied a cold, professional competence with a rifle. They also recruited Jim Masterson, the brother of the famous Bat Masterson, bringing decades of frontier experience to the team. In total, 13 men were chosen for the initial assault wave. They were told to bring their own rifles, preferably Winchesters in heavy calibers like 44-40 or 45-70, and as much ammunition as they could carry. They were instructed to leave behind any badges or uniform items that might be visible through a gap in the canvas. On the morning of August 31st, the team assembled at a staging area just outside of Stillwater, 10 miles west of Engles. The location was a secluded grove of pecan trees well off the main road, chosen to provide cover from passing travelers. The deputies arrived singly or in pairs to avoid drawing attention, converging on the wagons with their gear. They loaded the vehicles with a grim efficiency. The floorboards of the wagons were lined with straw and heavy wool blankets. This was not for the comfort of the men. It was a sound-dampening measure designed to muffle the sound of boots, gun stocks, and canteens clattering against the wood. Crates of extra ammunition were slid under the driver's seats, easily accessible but out of sight. Canteens were filled and wrapped in wet cloth to keep the water cool, though everyone knew the heat inside the canvas would be stifling. The division of the force was precise and tactical. Hickson took command of the first wagon. He selected a deputy to drive who could pass for a homesteader. Someone who could slouch convincingly on the bench, chew tobacco, and look non-threatening to a casual observer. Inside the back of the first wagon, 6 deputies squeezed into the narrow space. They sat facing each other, knees touching, their rifles held vertically between their legs to save space. The second wagon, commanded by Deputy Speed, carried the remainder of the force. The canvas covers were drawn tight and laced down, leaving only a small opening at the front for the driver and a slit at the rear for ventilation. Once the men were inside, the world outside disappeared, replaced by the filtering sunlight coming through the heavy fabric and the smell of the straw. The convoy rolled out of Stillwater in the late afternoon, timing their movement to approach the target area the following morning. The physical experience of riding in the back of the wagon was grueling, a test of endurance before the battle even began. The Oklahoma heat, even in late August, was intense, baking the landscape. Inside the canvas tunnel, the air was stagnant, unmoving, and filled with the fine, particulate dust kicked up by the wheels. The temperature rose well over 100 degrees within the enclosure. Sweat soaked through the deputies' shirts within minutes, stinging their eyes and making their grips on the rifles slippery. The wagon had no suspension. Every rut, rock, and hole in the road transferred a jarring impact directly through the wood to the spines of the men sitting on the floor. They braced themselves against the sideboards, trying to keep their bodies from slamming into one another, their muscles cramping from the confined posture. Silence was the absolute rule. Hickson had made it clear that a single cough, a sneeze, or the metallic click of a rifle hammer could compromise the entire operation. If the gang discovered them while they were trapped inside the wagons, the deputies would be slaughtered in a wooden box before they could return fire. The tactical disadvantage of the transport method was the lack of visibility and mobility. They were blind and caged. They communicated with hand signals in the dim light or whispers that were barely audible over the grinding of the iron tires on the dirt. They checked and rechecked their weapons obsessively. Every man ensured a round was chambered. They verified that the loading gates on their Winchesters were clear and that the magazines were topped off. The smell of gun oil mixed with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and straw, creating a distinctive, nauseating atmosphere that saturated their clothing. As they moved east toward Engles, they passed other travelers on the road. Through small gaps in the canvas lacing, the deputies caught glimpses of real homesteaders, families with children, wagons piled high with furniture, weary men walking alongside their oxen. The disguise worked flawlessly. The travelers glanced at the 2 covered wagons and saw nothing remarkable. They saw only 2 more loads of movers heading for the Strip, part of the Great Migration. They waved or nodded to the drivers, who returned the gestures with practiced indifference. The Outlaw's scouts, if they were watching from the hills, would see the same thing. The banality of the image was its greatest strength. The boomers provided a sea of noise and movement that swallowed the strike team whole. Night fell, bringing a small measure of relief from the heat, but increasing the tension. The convoy pulled off the road into a dry creek bed a few miles from Engles to wait for the final approach. They did not light a fire. The men ate cold biscuits and dried beef, chewing slowly and quietly. Hickson gathered the men in the darkness, speaking in a low voice. He reviewed the plan one last time. They would enter Ingalls from the west, rolling down Ash Street. They would not stop until they were in the center of town. Once the wagons halted, the men were to deploy instantly. They were to secure cover, identify the targets, and engage only when fired upon or when positive identification was made. Hickson emphasized the presence of civilians. Ingalls was a town with women and children. The deputies had to be precise. There could be no indiscriminate firing. The waiting was the hardest part. The men tried to sleep on the hard ground, but adrenaline kept most of them awake. They listened to the sounds of the night, the cry of a coyote, the rustle of wind in the blackjack oak, the stamping of the horses. They thought about the men they were hunting. Doolin, Dalton, Newcomb. These were not ordinary criminals. They were killers who had proven their willingness to die rather than surrender. The deputies knew that the next day would likely end in violence. Some wrote short letters to their wives or mothers, tucking them into their pockets. Others prayed silently. Leif Shadley sat with his back against a wagon wheel, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scraping sound a focus for his nerves. September 1st, 1893, Hickson roused the men. They watered the horses sparingly and checked the harnesses. The teamsters inspected the wagon wheels, kicking the tires to ensure the spokes were tight. They climbed back into the stifling confinement of the wagons. The convoy moved out, moving slowly to minimize the noise. The road to Engles was rougher here, the ruts deeper. The wagons swayed and bounced, throwing the men against the wooden ribs of the cover. They held their rifles across their chests to protect the sights, their knuckles white. As the sun began to breach the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and orange, they reached the outskirts of the town. The landscape opened up. To the south lay the thick timber where the gang often hid. To the north, the river. Directly ahead, the false fronts of the Ingalls buildings rose from the prairie. Hickson peered through the front opening, scanning the road. There were no sentries visible. The Dunn brothers were not at their usual post on the hill. Perhaps they had grown complacent, or perhaps the sheer volume of wagon traffic had made them lazy. The deception had held. The Trojan horse was at the gates. The wagons rolled past the first outlying shacks of Engles. A dog barked, a sharp staccato sound that made every deputy flinch, but no alarm was raised. The town was waking up. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. A woman was throwing dishwater out of a back door. So, drivers kept the horses at a slow, steady walk. They did not look left or right. They hunched over the reins, looking tired and bored. Inside the wagons, 13 hearts hammered against ribs. Fingers tightened on triggers. The safety catches were slid off. The sound of the horses' hooves changed from the dull thud of dirt to the crunch of gravel as they entered the main thoroughfare. They turned onto Ash Street. The wheels ground loudly in the quiet morning. To the casual observer, they were just 2 wagons passing through, perhaps stopping for supplies before heading to the land office. But inside, the payload was ready. They passed the livery stable on the right. Through the canvas slit, Speed could see the open doors of the stable and the shapes of high-quality horses inside, the gang's mounts. They were there. The intelligence was correct. They passed the chaotic clutter of the blacksmith shop. They rolled toward the intersection where the Trig and Ransom Saloon stood on one corner and the OK Hotel on the other. This was the kill zone. This was the center of the fortress. The drivers pulled on the reins, bringing the heavy wagons to a halt directly in front of the saloon, positioning themselves to block the view from the street. The brake levers were engaged with a ratcheting mechanical sound that echoed off the buildings. The horses blew air, dipping their heads. For a long, suspended second, nothing happened. The town was quiet. The saloon doors were closed. The hotel windows were blank eyes staring down at them. The deception was complete. They had successfully infiltrated the most dangerous square mile in the territory without firing a shot. The plan conceived in Guthrie had worked. Inside the wagon, Hickson caught the eye of Shadley. The interior was dim, striped with the light coming through the lacing. Sweat dripped from Hickson's nose. He nodded once. It was time to shed the disguise. The canvas was about to be thrown back, revealing not settlers and plows, but federal badges and Winchester rifles. The long journey from Guthrie, the sweating in the dark, the grinding anxiety of the road, it had all been for this specific moment of positioning. They were inside the perimeter. The enemy was yards away, unaware that the wooden structures they called home were now surrounded by the very law they mocked. The covered wagon deception had worked perfectly. Now the deception ended, and the reality of the confrontation took its place. The men braced their feet on the straw, ready to launch themselves into the street. The silence of the morning hung heavy, a fragile thing that was about to be shattered by the roar of black powder. September 1st, 1893 arrived with a stillness that belied the violence coiled within the two covered wagons now parked on Ash Street. The iron tires of the lead wagon, commanded by Deputy John Hickson, had ceased their grinding rotation, settling into the loose red dust directly across from the Trig and Ransom Saloon. The second wagon, under the command of Deputy Dick Speed, halted a few yards behind, angled slightly toward the blacksmith shop. Inside the canvas enclosures, the heat began to rise instantly as the airflow from the movement stopped. The sun, climbing steadily into the mid-morning sky, beat down on the heavy fabric, turning the wagon beds into ovens. The 13 deputies packed inside sat frozen in the semi-darkness, their knees locked together, sweat running in rivulets down their faces and soaking into the collars of their shirts. The air was thick with the smells of nervous perspiration, gun oil, and the dry, musty scent of the straw beneath their boots. For the first few minutes, no one moved. Hickson held up a hand in the dim light, a silent command for absolute discipline. They needed to assess the environment before revealing their presence. Through the small gaps in the canvas lacing and the slight opening at the front, the sounds of Engles drifted in, amplified by the tension of the listeners. They heard the rhythmic clanging of a hammer against an anvil from the blacksmith shop nearby, a mundane industrial noise that seemed jarringly normal. They heard the low murmur of voices from the boardwalks, the scuff of boots on wood, and the occasional creak of a door hinge. Somewhere near the livery stable, a horse whinnied, a sound that made Deputy Leif Shadley tighten his grip on the stock of his Winchester. These were the sounds of a town going about its daily business, completely unaware that a federal strike team was waiting within arm's reach of the community's center. The tactical situation was precarious. The wagons offered concealment, but they offered zero ballistic protection. The canvas would not stop a bullet. It would not even slow one down. If the gang inside the saloon or the hotel realized what was happening before the deputies could deploy, the wagons would become death traps. A few well-placed shots from a high-powered rifle would tear through the wood and flesh with ease. Hickson knew they could not stay inside for long. The element of surprise was a perishable asset, degrading with every second the strange wagons sat motionless in the middle of the street. The driver of Hickson's wagon slumped faintly on the bench, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, maintaining the charade of a weary traveler while his eyes scanned the saloon windows for any movement of the curtains. The signal to deploy was not a shout, but a series of sharp taps on the wooden bulkhead behind the driver's seat. Hickson moved first. He reached for the canvas flap at the rear of the wagon, unlacing it with steady fingers. The sudden influx of bright sunlight was blinding after the hours of darkness. He dropped to the ground, his boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The other deputies followed in a rapid, practiced stream. They did not jump recklessly. They slid out, keeping their profiles low, rifles held close to their bodies. Speed's team exited the second wagon simultaneously. Within 20 seconds, 13 heavily armed men stood in the center of Ash Street, the harmless facade of the movers vanishing to reveal a formidable paramilitary force. The transformation of the street from a public thoroughfare to a battlefield began immediately. Hickson signaled his men to scatter and secure cover. They moved with the urgency of men who knew they were standing on open ground in front of a fortified enemy position. Hickson, Shadley, and Deputy Thomas Houston moved toward a picket fence that ran along the north side of the street, offering a partial barricade and a line of sight to the saloon. The fence was waist-high, built of weathered cedar slats that had turned gray under the Oklahoma sun. It was not bulletproof, but it offered concealment and a rest for their rifles. They crouched behind it, the dry grass crunching under their boots, and leveled their weapons at the double doors of the saloon. Deputy Dick Speed, a marksman with a reputation for aggressive tactics, took a more exposed position. He moved toward the corner of the blacksmith shop, using the heavy timber frame of the building as hard cover. From this angle, he had a clear view of the livery stable and the side entrance of the saloon. He racked the lever of his Winchester, the metallic clack-clack sounding dangerously loud in the quiet street. He checked the chamber indicator, ensuring a brass cartridge was seated and ready. His eyes scanned the windows of the OK Hotel across the intersection. He knew from the intelligence reports that Arkansas Tom Jones often stayed in the corner room on the second floor. The window was open, a black square framing the darkness of the room inside. Speed kept his rifle trained on that void, waiting for a target to present itself. The remaining deputies fanned out, taking positions behind rain barrels, the wheels of the wagons, and the corners of adjacent buildings. They created a semicircle of overlapping fields of fire focused on the saloon and the hotel. They were now fully committed. There was no retreat. The wagons, which had been their sanctuary, were now obstacles in their line of fire. The town of Engles, which moments before had been a collection of wood and glass, was now a geometry of angles, kill zones, and cover. Every window was a potential sniper's nest. Every doorway was a potential ambush point. The deputies scanned the rooftops and the alleyways, their nerves stretched taut. The reaction of the townspeople was a slow, rippling wave of realization. A woman walking out of the general store with a basket of eggs froze when she saw the line of men kneeling behind the fence. Her eyes widened, fixing on the badges pinned to their vests and the rifles in their hands. She did not scream. She simply backed into the store and closed the door, turning the lock with a frantic click. A man crossing the street near the livery stable stopped mid-stride, looked at the deputies, and then broke into a run, disappearing behind a shed. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. The birds seemed to stop singing. The wind died down. The entire town seemed to inhale and hold its breath, waiting for the explosion. Inside the saloon, the outlaws remained oblivious to the noose tightening around them. The thick walls of the building dampened the sounds from the street. Bill Doolin, Bitter Creek Newcomb, Tulsa Jack, and Dynamite Dick were engaged in a game of poker, the cards slapping against the table, the whiskey bottle passing between them. They were relaxed, their guns hanging on the back of their chairs or resting on the table next to their chips. They felt secure in their fortress. They had no reason to suspect that the two wagons parked outside contained anything other than plows and bedding. The disconnect between the calm interior of the saloon and the deadly preparation occurring 15 yards away was absolute. Back on the street, Hickson took a moment to verify the targets. He looked toward the hitching rail in front of the saloon. There, tied loosely, were 5 horses. He recognized them instantly from the descriptions provided by informants. The large bay with the white stocking belonged to Doolin. The skittish sorrel was Newcomb's. The saddles were high-quality, tooled leather, far more expensive than anything a local farmer could afford. The presence of the horses confirmed the intelligence. The leadership of the gang was inside. They were trapped, but entrapment was not capture. Hickson knew that these men would not come out with their hands up. They would have to be driven out or carried out. The heat continued to build, the sun reflecting off the light-colored dust of the street, creating a glare that made the deputies squint. Sweat stung their eyes, blurring their vision momentarily. They wiped their faces with their sleeves, never taking their eyes off the targets. Deputy Shadley, crouching next to Hickson, adjusted the sights on his rifle. He was a veteran of the frontier, a man who had seen violence in many forms, but the tension of this standoff was unique. They were initiating a siege in the middle of a populated town. Civilians were everywhere, in the houses, in the stores, perhaps even in the saloon itself. The rules of engagement were strict, but in the chaos of a gunfight, rules often disintegrated. Shadley whispered to Hickson, asking if they should call out a surrender demand. Hickson shook his head. To call out now would be to give away their exact positions before they were ready. They needed to wait for a target to emerge. At the OK Hotel, the situation was equally critical. Arkansas, Tom Jones was indeed in his room, lying on the bed, reportedly suffering from a fever. His weapons were within reach, leaning against the nightstand. The window offered him a commanding view of the entire street, including the positions the deputies had just taken. If he woke up and looked out, he could flank the entire posse. He could rain fire down on Hickson and Shadley from above, pinning them behind the fence. The deputies were exposing their backs to the hotel to cover the saloon. It was a calculated risk. They were betting on the element of surprise, incapacitating Jones before he could organize a defense. Deputy Jim Masterson, positioned near the rear of the wagons, kept his eyes on the livery stable. The stable was a dark cavern, its depths obscured by shadows. It was possible that other gang members were inside, tending to the horses or sleeping in the loft. If fire came from the stable, the deputies would be caught in a crossfire between the saloon, the hotel, and the barn. Masterson held a double-barreled shotgun, a weapon devastating at close range. He watched the loft door, looking for the glint of a barrel or the movement of a shadow. He saw nothing but dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. The physical discomfort of the deputies increased. Their legs cramped from crouching. The heavy wool of their coats became unbearable. Flies, attracted by the sweat and the horses, buzzed around their faces, landing on their noses and eyelids. The men had to fight the urge to swat them away, knowing that a sudden movement could draw fire. They were statues made of flesh and anxiety, frozen in the prelude to violence. They checked the hammers of their rifles again and again, a nervous tick that provided a momentary distraction. Hickson scanned the street one more time. He saw the layout with a tactical clarity. The distance from the fence to the saloon door was barely 20 yards. At that range, a .44-40 bullet would hit with massive energy. There would be no missing. But the saloon had windows, curtained and dark. The outlaws could be watching them right now, sighting their own rifles. The uncertainty was the most grueling aspect of the wait. Were they the hunters, or were they already the prey? Hickson looked at Speed. Speed was calm, his face set in a mask of concentration. He was the tip of the spear, the trigger man. Then a sound broke the stillness of the standoff. It was the sound of a door latch lifting. The noise came from the front of the saloon. The heavy wooden door creaked inward. Hickson stiffened. Every rifle in the line shifted slightly, the muzzles converging on the dark rectangle of the open doorway. Fingers took up the slack on the triggers. The deputies stopped breathing. They waited to see who would step out into the sunlight. Would it be Doolin? Would it be a civilian? The silhouette was indistinct at first, a shape moving from the gloom into the glare. The figure stepped onto the boardwalk. It was a man, blinking against the harsh light. He stretched his arms, a casual, lazy movement. He was not holding a weapon in his hands. He wore a vest and a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up. It was George Bitter Creek Newcomb. He had stepped out for a breath of fresh air or perhaps to check on his horse. He stood there for a second, completely unaware that 13 rifles were aimed at his chest. He looked at the sky, checking the weather. He looked down the street toward the edge of town. Then his gaze drifted across the street to the picket fence. The moment of recognition was physical. Newcomb's body went rigid. His eyes locked onto the barrel of Hickson's rifle. He saw the badges. He saw the grim faces of the men he knew were hunting him. The relaxed posture of the outlaw vanished instantly, replaced by the primal reaction of a cornered animal. His hand dropped toward the revolver holstered on his hip. It was a reflex faster than thought. At the same time, he spun on his heel, diving back toward the safety of the saloon door. The kill zone was active. The wait was over. The friction of the moment had produced a spark. The deputies did not wait for a command. The threat was presented, identified, and reacting. Hickson shouted a warning, but the words were lost in the adrenaline surge. The town of Engles, which had been silent for the last 20 minutes, was about to be ripped apart. The atmosphere, heavy with heat and quiet, shattered. The birds took flight from the telephone wires. The horses at the hitching rail jerked their heads up, sensing the shift in the air. Speed, from his position at the blacksmith shop, had the clearest shot. He saw Newcomb go for his gun. He saw the intent to kill. He tracked the outlaw's movement, his cheek pressed hard against the walnut stock of his Winchester. The world narrowed down to the front sight post and the man on the porch. The decision was made. The Trojan horse was empty, the soldiers were on the field, and the enemy was in sight. The Battle of Ingalls had moved from a covert operation to an open engagement. The fuse that had been lit in Guthrie weeks ago had finally burned down to the powder keg. Hickson watched Newcomb scramble. He knew that once the firing started, it would not stop until one side was destroyed. He braced himself against the fence, his shoulder driving into the wood. He saw the other deputies doing the same. They were a single unit, a machine built for this specific purpose. They had endured the heat, the dust, and the fear. Now they had to do the work. The kill zone was no longer a theoretical concept on a map. It was the 30 yards of dirt between them and the saloon. And it was about to be filled with lead. At precisely noon, the suspended silence of Ash Street shattered. Deputy Dick Speed, positioned at the corner of the blacksmith shop, did not hesitate. The moment George Bitter Creek Newcomb's hand dropped toward the grip of his revolver, the engagement rules shifted from observation to immediate neutralization. Speed planted his feet firmly in the dust, pressing the brass butt plate of his Winchester against his shoulder. He did not aim for the center of mass in a general sense. He aimed for the specific mechanics of the threat. His eye aligned the front blade sight with the figure on the boardwalk. He exhaled a sharp breath and squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell, striking the primer of the .44-40 cartridge. The powder ignited, expanding rapidly to drive the lead slug down the rifled barrel. The report was a crisp, deafening crack that echoed instantly off the false fronts of the wooden buildings, signaling the end of the peace in Engles. The bullet crossed the short distance between the blacksmith shop and the saloon in a fraction of a second. It did not strike Newcomb in the chest as intended. As the outlaw turned to dive for the door, the projectile slammed into the magazine tube of the Winchester rifle he was holding. The impact was catastrophic. The tube, loaded with cartridges under spring tension, detonated. Metal shrapnel, lead fragments, and the heavy spring itself exploded outward. The force of the blow drove a jagged piece of the magazine tube deep into Newcomb's leg, tearing through the heavy fabric of his trousers and embedding itself in the muscle of his thigh. The kinetic energy spun him around, throwing him violently against the rough siding of the saloon wall. He did not scream immediately. The shock was too profound. He collapsed onto the wooden planks of the porch, his leg useless, blood beginning to darken the wood instantly. The sound of Speed's shot acted as a starter pistol for the 12 other deputies. The restraint that had held them motionless behind the picket fence and the wagon wheels evaporated. Deputy John Hickson, kneeling behind the gray cedar slats, shouted a command to fire, though his voice was lost in the roar that followed. The entire line of lawmen opened up on the front of the Trigg and Ransom saloon. The volley was not sporadic. It was a wall of lead. 12 large-bore rifles discharged almost simultaneously, creating a thunderclap that shook the ground. The air, previously clear and hot, filled instantly with the white-gray smoke of black powder, obscuring the view and stinging the nostrils with the smell of sulfur and burning potassium nitrate. The physical destruction of the saloon facade began in earnest. The bullets from the deputies' Winchesters punched through the thin clapboard siding as if it were paper. Splinters of wood, some as large as knives, flew into the street and into the interior of the building. The glass windows, which had been reflecting the peaceful sky moments before, disintegrated into sparkling clouds of shards. The window frames were chewed apart by the impacts. The heavy wooden door, which Newcomb had been trying to reach, was riddled with holes, daylight streaming through the jagged gaps. The saloon sign hanging above the entrance took a hit, swinging wildly on one hinge before crashing to the boardwalk. Inside the saloon, the scene descended into absolute chaos. The poker game that had been occupying Bill Doolin, Bill Dalton, Tulsa Jack, and Dynamite Dick ended with the table being overturned. They did not need to be told what was happening. The sound of the incoming fire was unmistakable. It was the sound of a coordinated ambush. Bullets zipped through the room, smashing the mirror behind the bar, sending showers of reflective glass onto the rows of bottles. Whiskey bottles exploded, spraying amber liquid and glass across the room. The air inside filled with dust dislodged from the ceiling rafters and the smoke drifting in from the street. Doolin, reacting with the instincts of a survivor, dove for the floor, shouting for the others to get down. He scrambled toward his rifle, which was leaning against the wall. The floorboards around him erupted as bullets angled downward through the front wall, chewing up the wood. There was no safe space in the front room. The bar itself, a heavy oak structure, offered the only substantial cover. The outlaws crawled behind it, pressing their backs against the wood, listening to the relentless hammering of the lead storm outside. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar of gunfire and breaking material. Outside on the porch, Newcomb was in a desperate struggle for survival. He was exposed, wounded, and lying in the center of the kill zone. Bullets from the deputies were snapping over his head and thudding into the wall inches from his body. He dragged himself across the planks, leaving a smear of bright arterial blood behind him. He reached the doorframe, using his good leg to push himself over the threshold. He tumbled into the smoky interior of the saloon, gasping for breath, clutching his mangled leg. The pain was beginning to register now, a searing white-hot agony that radiated from his thigh. He looked down to see the twisted metal protruding from his flesh. He had been neutralized as a combatant for the moment, reduced to a casualty before he had fired a single shot. The violence spilled over to the animals tied at the hitching rail. The 5 horses, prized mounts bred for speed and endurance, were trapped in the crossfire. They screamed in terror, rearing and pulling against their reins. The leather straps held fast, tethering them to the rail which was now being shredded by bullets. A stray round, or perhaps one aimed intentionally to cut off an escape, struck the large bay horse belonging to Doolin. The bullet entered the animal's chest, piercing the heart. The horse collapsed instantly, its heavy body hitting the dust with a ground-shaking thud. The other horses, maddened by the noise and the scent of blood, kicked and bit at each other, tangling their leads. One broke loose, galloping blindly down the street, stirrups flapping, heading toward the open prairie. The loss of the horses changed the tactical reality immediately. The gang's primary means of rapid egress was being destroyed. The deputies behind the fence worked their lever-action rifles with mechanical precision. Hickson fired, racked the lever, and fired again. He was not aiming at specific men now, he was suppressing the enemy position. He aimed for the windows and the thin walls, knowing that the bullets would pass through and potentially hit anyone hiding inside. The brass casings from their rifles flew through the air, glinting in the sun before landing in the dirt, piling up around their knees. The barrels of their weapons began to heat up, the steel becoming hot to the touch. The smoke hung low in the street, trapped by the buildings, creating a fog of war that reduced visibility to a few yards. Deputy Leif Shadley, positioned near Hickson, shifted his fire to the second floor of the building, concerned about snipers. He put 2 rounds through the upper windows, shattering the glass. He paused to reload, shoving fresh cartridges into the loading gate of his rifle. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The sheer volume of fire they were putting out was incredible, but there was no return fire yet. The surprise had been total. They had caught the gang completely unprepared. But Shadley knew this one-sided dynamic would not last. These were dangerous men. They would recover, and they would shoot back. Down the street, the civilian population of Engles reacted with panic. The woman in the general store dropped to the floor behind the counter, covering her head with her arms as the sound of the battle penetrated the walls. The store owner, a man who had sold ammunition to the gang just days before, locked the back door and huddled in the corner. People in the houses along Ash Street pulled their children under beds and tables. The illusion of the peaceful coexistence between the town and the outlaws was gone. The reality was now metal and death flying through the air. Dr. Pickering in his drugstore froze as he heard the initial volley. He knew exactly what it meant. He grabbed his medical bag, not knowing if he would be called to treat an outlaw or a marshal. Back at the blacksmith shop, Speed remained focused. He had fired the first shot, and he kept his rifle trained on the saloon door. He saw Newcomb crawl inside. He saw the horse go down. He knew he had drawn blood. He scanned the livery stable again, worried about a flank attack. The doors of the stable were open, dark maws that could hide anything. He put a round into the doorframe of the stable just to keep anyone inside honest. The wood splintered, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Speed was operating on pure adrenaline, his senses heightened. He could hear the distinct sound of the different rifles firing, the heavy boom of the 45-70s and the sharper crack of the 44s. Inside the saloon, the shock was wearing off. Doolin, crouching behind the bar, checked his weapon. It was loaded. He looked at his men. They were shaken but unhurt, except for Newcomb, who was groaning on the floor. Doolin knew they were trapped. The front of the building was a death trap. They needed to return fire to suppress the marshals long enough to formulate a plan. He crawled to the back of the room toward the rear exit that led to the livery stable. The bullets were still coming through the front wall, zipping over his head, thudding into the back wall. He signaled for Dalton to join him. They needed to get to the horses that were in the stable. The ones out front were dead or useless. Dalton moved to one of the side windows that faced the alley. He used the barrel of his rifle to smash the remaining glass out of the frame. He peered out cautiously. He could see the corner of the blacksmith shop where Speed was positioned. He raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the sill. He took a snapshot. The bullet struck the heavy timber of the shop, inches from Speed's head. Speed ducked, splinters spraying his face. The return fire had begun. The marshals were no longer firing at a passive target. The target was biting back. Hickson saw the puff of smoke from the side window. He shouted for his men to shift fire. 3 deputies turned their weapons toward the side of the saloon. They unleashed a concentrated burst that chewed up the window frame and forced Dalton to duck back inside. The coordination of the posse was holding. They were communicating, shifting sectors of fire and maintaining the pressure, but the ammunition expenditure was high. Hickson checked his belt. He had fired 10 rounds in less than a minute. At this rate, they would burn through their combat load quickly. He hoped the wagon drivers had the crates of extra ammo ready to pass out. The street itself was being transformed. The dust kicked up by the muzzle blasts and the bullet impacts hung in the air like a thick, choking curtain. The visibility dropped. The deputies fired at muzzle flashes now rather than clear targets. The smell of the black powder was intense, coating the back of their throats with a metallic taste. The sun, still high overhead, beat down through the smoke, creating a surreal, hazy lighting. The heat was oppressive. Sweat ran into their eyes, mixing with the grit and the gunpowder residue. Arkansas Tom Jones in the OK Hotel was awake. The initial volley had jolted him from his feverish sleep. He sat up, grabbing his rifle. He crawled to the window, keeping low. He looked out and saw the tops of the covered wagons and the line of deputies behind the fence. He realized immediately what was happening. He was cut off from the rest of the gang in the saloon. But he also realized he had the high ground. He had a perfect view of the deputies' backs. He did not fire yet. He waited, watching, assessing the targets. He checked his ammunition. He was the joker in the deck, the variable the deputies had not yet neutralized. He positioned himself in the shadow of the room, invisible from the street, and began to track the lawmen below. The battle had now settled into a rhythm of violence. The initial explosion of noise had transitioned into a steady, rolling thunder. The deputies fired in a controlled manner, picking their shots. The outlaws fired back sporadically, blind shots through the walls and windows intended to keep the lawmen's heads down. The distance between the combatants was less than 30 yards. It was close-range, intimate violence. A man could shout and be heard by his enemy during a lull in the shooting. But there were no lulls. There was only the cycle of working the lever, aiming, firing, and reloading. Newcomb, inside the saloon, managed to drag himself behind the bar. He tore a strip from his shirt and tied it around his leg, pulling it tight to stem the bleeding. The pain was sickening, making his vision swim. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the floor, uncorked it with his teeth, and took a long pull. The alcohol burned his throat but dulled the edge of the agony. He picked up his revolver. His rifle was destroyed. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. He was still in the fight. He crawled toward the back door, trailing blood, determined not to die in the front room. The destruction of the saloon continued. The mirror behind the bar was gone. The shelves were decimated. The portrait of a racehorse that hung on the wall was riddled with holes. The very structure of the building was being compromised. The deputies were dismantling it plank by plank. The sawdust floated in the air, mixing with the smoke. It was a scene of industrial demolition carried about by small arms fire. Hickson signaled to Shadley. They needed to advance or flank. Staying behind the fence left them vulnerable if the gang tried to break out the back. But moving into the street meant entering the open ground. They held their positions, pouring fire into the building, hoping to force a surrender. But no white flag appeared. The only response was more bullets. The first 5 minutes of the engagement had passed. The town of Engles was no longer a sanctuary. It was a killing field. The surprise attack had worked to trap the gang, but it had failed to end the fight quickly. Now it was a siege. The deputies were committed. The outlaws were cornered. The only way out was through the other side. The first shot had been fired, the first blood had been spilled, and the first horse was dead. The escalation was just beginning. The sheer brute force of the confrontation was evident in the shredded wood and the deafening noise. The battle would not be decided by negotiation. It would be decided by who had the most ammunition and the will to stand. By 12:15 p.m., the tactical engagement on Ash Street had evolved from a surprise ambush into a mechanical process of destruction. The 13 U.S. Deputy Marshals, positioned in a semicircle around the front and side of the Trojan ransom saloon, maintained a rate of fire that was relentless, deafening, and systematic. The initial volley, which had occurred minutes earlier, had been a single thunderous crash, but the subsequent shooting settled into a chaotic rolling rhythm. The sharp cracks of the 44-40 Winchesters mixed with the deeper resonant booms of the 45-70 government rifles, creating a continuous wall of noise that made verbal communication impossible for the men on the line. Deputy John Hickson, crouching behind the gray slats of the picket fence, signaled his orders with hand gestures, sharp chopping motions pointing to specific windows or sections of the wall that required suppression. The physical disintegration of the saloon was the primary visual dominance of the battle. The structure was built of standard pine clapboard, a material that offered no ballistic resistance to the heavy lead slugs fired by the lawmen. The bullets did not merely penetrate the wood, they shattered it. Each impact sent a spray of yellow splinters erupting into the street or into the interior of the room. The white paint on the front of the building flaked away in clouds of dust as the siding was perforated hundreds of times. The windows, already devoid of glass from the opening seconds of the fight, were now having their wooden frames disassembled by the gunfire. The sash weights and pulleys inside the jambs were struck, twisting the metal and jamming the mechanisms. The saloon sign, which had been hanging above the entrance, took multiple hits to its supports, swinging wildly on one hinge before crashing to the boardwalk, where it was immediately chewed into unrecognizable debris by low-angle shots. Inside the building, the environment was a nightmare of flying particulate and ricocheting metal. The air was thick with a haze of plaster dust, sawdust, and gun smoke that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. Bill Doolin, Bill Dalton, Tulsa Jack Blake, and Dynamite Dick Clifton were forced to stay prone on the floorboards or huddled tightly behind the heavy oak bar. The bar itself was the only object in the room capable of stopping a bullet, but even it was being eroded. Slugs slammed into the front of the counter, gouging out deep trenches in the polished wood and sending vibrations through the structure that the men could feel against their spines. Bottles of whiskey and beer that had survived the first minute were now exploding systematically as stray rounds swept the shelves, dousing the floor in alcohol and adding the sharp scent of spirits to the acrid smell of burning powder. Bitter Creek. Newcomb lay near the end of the bar, his back pressed hard against the wood. The makeshift tourniquet on his leg was soaked, through with dark blood, but the flow had slowed to a steady ooze. He held his revolver in a white-knuckled grip, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was unable to stand or maneuver effectively due to the catastrophic injury from the magazine explosion. The pain was a constant grinding presence, searing white-hot with every heartbeat. But the adrenaline of the firefight kept him conscious. He watched the front wall of the saloon turn into a sieve. Shafts of bright sunlight pierced the gloom through the hundreds of bullet holes, creating a surreal lighting effect where beams of light danced in the smoke-filled room. Every time a bullet passed through the wall, it made a distinctive thwack hiss sound, followed immediately by the impact against the back wall or the furniture. The deputies outside were operating with the efficiency of a factory line. Hickson and Leif Shadley worked in tandem behind the picket fence. While one fired, the other reloaded. They shoved fresh cartridges through the loading gates of their Winchesters, their fingers moving with practiced speed, despite the fine tremors of combat stress. The brass casings ejected from their rifles piled up in the dirt around their knees, shimmering in the sun and hot enough to burn skin. The barrels of their weapons radiated heat, distorting the air above the sights with shimmering waves. Hickson had to be careful not to touch the metal of the barrel, gripping only the wooden forearm, which was becoming slippery with sweat. The sheer volume of ammunition they were expending was staggering. They were not firing at specific targets anymore. They were firing to deny the enemy any ability to return effective fire. They were turning the interior of the saloon into a zone where standing up meant death. Deputy Thomas Houston, positioned near the rear wheel of the lead wagon, focused his fire on the doorframe. He knew that the gang would eventually try to break out. He wanted to make the threshold impassable. He fired round after round into the door jambs, splintering the wood and exposing the framing studs. He saw movement inside, a shadow shifting a hat brim, and he fired at the motion. There was no hesitation in his actions. The lawmen understood that they were facing the most dangerous men in the territory. If the gang was allowed to reorganize or reach their horses, the siege would fail. The objective was total containment. The siege extended to the livery stable located just south of the saloon. The stable was a critical strategic point because it housed the gang's mounts and offered a potential escape route to the east. Deputy Dick Speed, from his vantage point at the blacksmith shop, poured fire into the wide, dark opening of the barn doors. He could hear the horses inside screaming and kicking the stall walls, their panic adding a layer of biological terror to the mechanical noise of the guns. Speed fired at the loft, suspecting that a rifleman might be hiding in the hay. He fired at the support posts. He wanted to ensure that if the gang managed to exit the saloon and reach the stable, they would find no sanctuary there. The heavy .44 caliber bullets slapped into the barnwood, sounding like hammer strikes against a coffin. Back inside the saloon, Doolin crawled toward the rear of the room. The floor was covered in broken glass and debris that cut his hands and knees, but he ignored the lacerations. He knew the front room was becoming a tomb. The structural integrity of the front wall was failing. If the marshals kept up this rate of fire, there would be no cover left within 10 minutes. He shouted to Dalton, his voice barely audible over the roar. They needed to move to the livery stable. It was their only chance to get to the horses and break the encirclement. The connection between the saloon and the stable was an open area, a deadly gap they would have to cross, but staying put was suicide. Tulsa Jack and Dynamite Dick covered the rear windows. They poked the barrels of their rifles through the shattered panes and fired blindly into the street to keep the deputies' heads down. They didn't aim. They just pumped lead out to create a buffer. The recoil of the rifles punched against their shoulders repeatedly. Their eyes were stinging and watering from the thick smoke that refused to clear. Dynamite Dick, a man known for his volatility, was cursing continuously, a stream of profanity that was lost in the din. He fired until his rifle clicked empty, then fumbled for a fresh box of cartridges in his pocket, ripping the cardboard open and spilling half the rounds onto the floor in his haste. He scooped them up with shaking fingers, jamming them into the magazine tube. The psychological pressure on the gang was immense. They were accustomed to being the aggressors, the ones holding the guns while terrified clerks opened safes. Now they were on the receiving end of overwhelming force. The realization that the federal government had sent a dedicated hit squad to kill them was sinking in. This was not a local sheriff chasing them away. This was a military operation. The walls were literally closing in on them as the bullets chewed away the perimeter of the room. Doolin looked at Newcomb. He knew they couldn't leave him behind, but dragging a wounded man across open ground would slow them down fatally. It was a brutal calculus of survival. Outside, the heat of the day was intensifying. It was now past 1 p.m. The sun was directly overhead, baking the deputies in their heavy coats. Sweat ran down their backs and soaked their hat bands. Their mouths were dry as dust. They had no water. They had been in position for over an hour, first in the wagons and now in the fight. Fatigue began to set in. The muscles in their arms burned from holding the heavy rifles steady. The constant recoil was bruising their shoulders, but Hickson kept them focused. He moved down the line, crouching low, checking the ammunition supply. They still had plenty of rounds in the crates, but reloading the tubular magazines of the Winchesters was a slow process that took a man out of the fight for crucial seconds. Hickson signaled to Jim Masterson. He wanted Masterson to shift his position to cover the alleyway between the saloon and the hotel. Hickson anticipated the move to the stable. Masterson nodded, grabbing his shotgun and sprinting low across a gap in the cover to a rain barrel situated near the corner of the general store. He arrived safely, his chest heaving from the exertion. He leveled the shotgun at the alley. At close range, the buckshot would be devastating. He watched the back corner of the saloon, waiting for a target to emerge. The town of Engles itself seemed to be groaning under the assault. The sheer amount of lead flying through the air was cutting telephone lines and damaging nearby structures. A stray bullet struck the bell in the small church tower down the street, producing a singular, mournful gong sound that rang out incongruously over the gunfire. The dust cloud raised by the battle drifted over the entire settlement, coating everything in a fine red powder. The smell of the black powder was now the dominant scent, masking the usual odors of manure and cooking fires. Windows in adjacent buildings shattered from the concussive force of the blasts or from erratic shots. Inside the saloon, the situation reached a critical point. A bullet struck the stovepipe of the potbelly stove, knocking it loose from its ceiling mount. Soot and ash poured into the room, adding to the visual obscurity and coating the men in gray filth. Doolin made the decision. They would go. He grabbed Newcomb by the back of his vest and dragged him toward the rear door. Dalton and the others provided covering fire, emptying their magazines into the front wall. The noise inside was ear-splitting as they fired simultaneously. They were trying to create a wall of sound that would make the marshals flinch, buying them the few seconds they needed to exit the building. Doolin kicked the back door open. The bright light of the afternoon flooded into the dim back room. The alleyway led directly to the side door of the livery stable. It was a distance of perhaps 15 yards. In a gunfight, 15 yards is an eternity. Doolin looked at the gap. He could see the dust kicking up in the alley from the deputies' stray rounds. He looked back at his men. They were ready. Their faces were grim, streaked with soot and sweat. They checked their weapons one last time, ensuring full loads. The deputies sensed the shift in the battle's momentum. The volume of fire from the saloon dropped momentarily as the gang regrouped for the dash. Hickson shouted a warning. "Watch the back! They're moving!" The deputies adjusted their aim. The focus shifted from the front windows to the corners of the building. They knew the layout. They knew where the rats would run when the hole was smoked out. Speed at the blacksmith shop had the best angle on the gap between the buildings. He steadied his rifle on the anvil, taking a deep breath to lower his heart rate. He was ready to intercept the transfer. The siege of the Ransom Saloon had accomplished its primary objective. It had flushed the quarry from their fortified position. The building was ruined, a shell of splintered wood and broken glass. It could no longer protect the outlaws. But the siege had not ended the fight. It had merely forced the combat into a new, more dangerous phase. The containment was about to break. The gang was desperate, cornered, and moving. The static exchange of fire was ending. The dynamic running gun battle was about to begin. As Doolin prepared to step out into the alley, he looked at the ruin of the room one last time. The floor was a carpet of brass casings and broken glass. The sunlight streamed through the walls like a sieve. It was a scene of absolute devastation. They had turned the town into a fortress, and the marshals had turned the fortress into a pile of kindling. There was no going back. The only way was forward, into the guns. Doolin tightened his grip on Newcomb's collar. He took a breath of the smoky air, then he stepped into the light. The tactical equilibrium of the battle shifted violently at 1:30 p.m., while the main body of the posse focused their kinetic energy on the disintegration of the saloon and the livery stable. A singular lethal variable introduced itself from the periphery. Arkansas Tom Jones, the youngest member of the Doolin gang, was positioned in a corner room on the second floor of the OK Hotel. The hotel, a two-story wood frame structure, stood diagonally across the intersection from the saloon. This elevation provided Jones with a geometric advantage that the deputies on the ground had failed to neutralize in the opening minutes of the engagement. From his window, the battlefield was not a horizontal plane of obstacles and cover. It was a map laid out below him, exposing the defilade positions of the lawmen. Jones stood back from the window frame, concealed by the deep shadows of the room. The air inside was stagnant and sweltering, trapped between the ceiling and the floorboards, heating up as the afternoon sun beat against the roof. He held a Winchester rifle, the stock pressed tight against his ribs. He was not firing rapidly like the men in the saloon. He was observing. He watched the deputies crouching behind the picket fence. He saw the tops of their hats and the curve of their spines as they reloaded. To the men on the ground, the fence was a solid wall of protection. To Jones, looking down at a steep angle, the fence was a negligible line that offered zero concealment for their upper bodies. He racked the lever of his rifle. The mechanical action was smooth, sliding a fresh cartridge into the chamber and cocking the hammer. He stepped closer to the window, raising the barrel slowly to avoid catching the light. He rested the forestock against the sash, stabilizing the weapon. His breathing was controlled, a sharp contrast to the chaotic panic of the horses screaming in the street below. He did not feel the desperation of his Confederates trapped in the saloon. He felt the cold detachment of a hunter in a blind. He had the entire flank of the federal force exposed to his sights. His first target was Deputy Thomas Houston. Houston was positioned behind the cover of the lead wagon's wheel, firing steadily into the saloon's front door. He believed he was safe from the return fire coming from the saloon because of the heavy wood of the wagon and the angle of the street. He did not look up. Jones aligned the front sight of his Winchester with the center of Houston's back. The distance was less than 40 yards. At this range, ballistic drop was non-existent. Jones exhaled, his finger tightening on the trigger until the sear broke. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The report was loud within the confined space of the room, distinct from the roar outside. The bullet cleared the windowsill, traversed the open air of the intersection, and struck Deputy Houston. The impact was devastating. The heavy lead slug entered Houston's body at a downward trajectory, bypassing the protection of his ribs and driving deep into his abdominal cavity. The shock to his system was immediate. Houston crumpled, his rifle falling from his hands into the dust. He did not cry out instantly. The air had been driven from his lungs. He collapsed against the wagon wheel, his legs losing all motor function. The confusion among the deputies was absolute. They saw Houston go down, but they did not see a muzzle flash from the saloon. They assumed a stray round had passed through the walls. They did not look up. They continued to fire at the saloon, unaware that the vector of the threat had changed. Jones worked the lever of his rifle again, ejecting the spent brass casing onto the floorboards of the hotel room. It chimed as it hit the wood, a small metallic sound in the quiet room. He acquired his next target. Deputy Leif Shadley was kneeling behind the picket fence, fully engaged in suppressing the saloon windows. He was exposed to the hotel window from the waist up. Jones shifted his aim slightly. He tracked Shadley's movements. When Shadley paused to wipe sweat from his eyes, Jones fired. The bullet struck the ground inches from Shadley's knee, kicking up a geyser of red dirt. Shadley threw himself flat, rolling away from the fence. He shouted to Hickson, pointing toward the hotel. The realization hit the squad leader like a physical blow. They were being flanked from above. The safe side of their cover was now a kill zone. But the greatest threat to the gang's escape was not Shadley or Houston, it was Deputy Dick Speed. Positioned at the corner of the blacksmith shop, Speed had a clear line of sight to the alleyway between the saloon and the livery stable. He was the cork in the bottle, the man whose rifle prevented Doolin and the others from crossing the gap to their horses. Jones recognized this tactical reality. He knew that as long as Speed controlled that alley, the gang died in the saloon. Jones shifted his position to a different window on the west wall of the room to get a better angle on the blacksmith shop. Speed was firing rhythmically, his focus entirely on the gap between the buildings. He did not see the movement in the hotel window. Jones settled the rifle against the frame. This was a harder shot, the distance slightly longer, the angle more oblique. He took a moment to steady his heart rate. He focused on the deputy's shoulder, the point where the suspenders crossed the shirt. He was not shooting to wound, he was shooting to remove the obstacle. Jones squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked. The bullet struck Dick Speed in the upper torso. The impact spun the deputy around, slamming him against the rough timber of the blacksmith shop wall. He slid down the wood, his legs splaying out in the dirt. The rifle slipped from his grasp. The wound was catastrophic. The bullet had likely struck a major artery or the heart itself. Speed's eyes went wide with the shock of the trauma, then glazed over. He slumped forward, his face pressing into the dust of the street he had been commanding seconds before. The firing from the blacksmith shop ceased instantly. The death of Dick Speed was the turning point of the battle's second phase. The volume of fire directed at the livery stable dropped to zero. The alleyway was open. Jones had single-handedly cleared the path for the breakout. Inside the hotel room, the smoke from the black powder cartridges began to fill the upper air, creating a gray ceiling. Jones coughed, the sulfur taste sharp in his throat. He did not stop. He returned to the first window. He saw the deputies scrambling, trying to reorient their cover to face the hotel. They were dragging Houston's body toward the rear of the wagons. Jones fired again, this time suppressing the deputies near the wagons. He put a round through the canvas cover of the second wagon, making the wood splinter. He clipped the top of the picket fence, sending slivers of cedar flying into the faces of the men hiding there. He was pinning down an entire federal posse with a single rifle. The psychological effect was more damaging than the physical one. The deputies felt naked, exposed to an eye in the sky that could pick them apart at will. They huddled low, pressing their bodies into the dirt, their offensive momentum broken. Hickson, realizing the gravity of the situation, screamed orders to shift fire. "The hotel! Top floor! Kill him!" The deputies, desperate to neutralize the sniper, turned their weapons upward. The facade of the OK Hotel erupted into splinters. Bullets from the Marshals' heavy rifles tore through the siding, punching into the room where Jones stood. The glass in the windows shattered completely, raining shards onto the floor. Jones threw himself to the floorboards, crawling beneath the level of the windowsill. The room became a chaotic storm of debris. Bullets ripped through the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. Plaster dust exploded from the lath, coating Jones in a fine white powder. A round struck the iron bed frame, ringing like a bell and sending a ricochet whining around the room. Jones stayed low, moving on his elbows and knees. He popped up for a second, fired a snapshot into the street, and dropped back down before the return fire could find him. He was playing a deadly game of whack-a-mole, drawing the fire of 13 men to himself. Every second that the deputies spent shooting at the hotel was a second they were not shooting at the alleyway. Jones knew this. He accepted the role of the lightning rod. He listened to the thud of bullets hitting the exterior wood, gauging the intensity of the volley. When there was a lull, he rose again. He saw Deputy Shadley trying to move to a new position near the general store. Jones fired, the bullet striking the wooden post next to Shadley's head. Shadley dove for cover again. Jones had established dominance over the street. The physical toll on Jones was mounting. The noise in the enclosed room was deafening, leaving his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the shouts from below. The recoil of the rifle was bruising his shoulder. The heat was unbearable, but his hands remained steady. He reloaded the tubular magazine of the Winchester, sliding the brass cartridges in one by one. Click, click, click. He counted his remaining ammunition. He had enough to hold them for a while longer. Down on the street, the scene was one of carnage and confusion. Houston was bleeding out, his breathing ragged and wet. Speed was dead, his body lying motionless in the open. The other deputies were pinned, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to the sniper. The civilians of Engles, huddled in their cellars, heard the shift in the battle. The sound had changed from a concentrated roar at the saloon to a dispersed, multi-directional exchange. Jones looked toward the livery stable. He saw movement. Doolin and the others were making their run. They were crossing the gap that Speed had been guarding. Jones fired 2 rapid shots at the corner of the blacksmith shop just in case any deputy tried to reoccupy the position. The bullets kicked up dust, ensuring the area remained denied territory. He watched as the gang reached the stable doors. His job was half done. Now he had to cover their exit from the town. The deputies began to concentrate their fire on the specific window Jones was using. A hail of lead shredded the sash and the curtains. A bullet grazed Jones's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. He flinched but did not retreat. He moved to the other side of the room, using a small gap in the wall where a previous bullet had punched through the siding. He used it as a loophole, sighting through the jagged hole. He fired at the legs of a deputy visible under the wagon. The man jerked his leg back, shouting in alarm. The hotel proprietress, Mary Pierce, was cowering in the kitchen on the ground floor. She listened to the destruction of her property upstairs. The ceiling shook with the footsteps of the outlaw and the impact of the incoming rounds. She knew her hotel was being turned into a sieve. The battle had invaded the sanctity of a domestic space. The furniture upstairs, the bed, the wash basin, the dresser, was being destroyed. The mirrors were smashed. The pitcher on the stand was shattered. Jones checked the street again. The deputies were bringing the heavy buffalo guns to bear. A .45-70 slug tore through the wall, passed through the mattress on the bed, and exited the rear wall of the hotel. The power of the weaponry was terrifying. The walls offered no real protection. Jones was relying on luck and the small profile he presented. He knew he was trapped. He could not leave the room. The stairs led down to a lobby that was visible from the street. If he tried to run, he would be cut down before he reached the back door. His fate was tied to the room. He resigned himself to the siege. He would stay in the Oak Hotel until he ran out of ammunition or until they blew the building down. He took a sip of water from a canteen he had on the floor, the liquid warm and tasting of tin. He wiped the blood from his cheek. He looked at the body of Dick Speed lying in the dust. It was a grim validation of his skill. He had taken the most dangerous piece off the board. The sun moved lower in the sky, changing the shadows in the room. The beams of light coming through the bullet holes shifted angles. Jones adjusted his position. He was a solitary figure in a ruined room, waging a war against the United States government. He felt a strange clarity. The complexities of his life, the robberies, the running, the fear, had distilled down to this simple mechanic. See the target, align the sights, squeeze the trigger. The marshals were now shouting to each other, trying to coordinate a rush on the hotel. Jones heard them. He waited. If they came through the front door, he would shoot them on the stairs. He checked his revolver, making sure it was ready for close work. He was prepared to turn the hotel into a slaughterhouse. He fired a shot through the floorboards near the entrance just to let them know he was thinking about the approach. The marshals held back. As the afternoon wore on, the stalemate solidified. Jones held the high ground. The deputies held the street. But the cost had been paid in blood. 2 lawmen were down, 1 dead and 1 dying. The gang was moving toward their horses. The sniper in the hotel had bought the Doolin gang a future, paying for it with the lives of the men below and his own freedom. He was the anchor holding the ship against the storm, and the storm was raging against the thin wooden walls of the hotel. 3:45 p.m. witnessed the transformation of the Murray brothers livery stable from a place of commerce into a containment vessel of biological panic and concentrated desperation. While the gunfight raged outside, reverberating against the single-walled wooden siding like a continuous rolling thunder, the atmosphere inside the barn was defined by the terrified reactions of the livestock. The air was thick, heavy with the ammoniac stench of horse urine, the copper tang of fresh blood from a grazed animal, and the choking cloud of dust kicked up by iron-shod hooves striking the dirt floor. The horses, high-strung animals bred for speed and responsiveness, were in a state of absolute frenzy. They pulled violently against their halter ropes, their eyes rolling back to expose the whites, their nostrils flared wide to pull in the smoke-tinged air. The sound of their screaming, a high-pitched guttural whinnying, competed with the sharp cracks of the rifles echoing from the street, creating a cacophony that vibrated in the teeth of the men trying to control them. Bill Doolin, Bill Dalton, Tulsa Jack Blake, and Dynamite Dick Clifton moved among the animals with a desperate, forceful urgency that bordered on violence. They understood with a cold clarity that the structure they occupied was no longer a shelter. It was a coffin waiting to be nailed shut. The marshals were systematically dismantling the town, and eventually the heavy-caliber weapons would turn their attention to the stable walls, turning the thin pine planks into a storm of lethal splinters. The only route to survival lay in the open ground to the southwest, a direct suicidal run through the firing lanes of the federal posse. Escape required mobility, and mobility required the horses. Without them, they were dead men walking in a town that had become a shooting gallery. Doolin moved to his mount, a powerful bay that was lathered in white foam from the stress of the noise. He did not soothe the animal with soft words or gentle touches. There was no time for horsemanship. He grabbed the bridle, forcing the iron bit into the horse's mouth, the metal clanking against the teeth. He tightened the cinch of the saddle with a brutal strength, hauling on the leather strap until the horse groaned, ensuring the tack would not slip during the violent maneuvers to come. His hands were steady, though covered in the grime of the saloon floor and the soot of the battle. He checked the stirrups and the reins, his mind focused entirely on the mechanics of the getaway. Every buckle had to hold, every strap had to be sound. An equipment failure in the next 60 seconds would mean a prison sentence or a grave. Near the rear of the stable, Bitter Creek Newcomb slumped against a grain bin, his face the color of gray ash, drained of blood. The jagged wound in his leg inflicted by the magazine explosion hours earlier had stiffened. the muscles locking up in a spasm of trauma. He gripped his revolver, but his ability to ride was severely compromised. Doolin and Dalton moved to him, ignoring his groans. They did not discuss the logistics, they simply acted. They hauled Newcomb to his feet, his injured leg dragging uselessly in the straw, leaving a trail in the dirt. They lifted him bodily into the saddle of his horse, a nervous sorrel that danced sideways under the sudden unbalanced weight. Newcomb gritted his teeth, a low sound of agony escaping his throat as his leg hung down. But he gripped the saddle horn with both hands, his knuckles white. Doolin took the reins of Newcomb's horse, wrapping them tightly around his own gloved hand. He would pony the wounded man out. Newcomb was cargo now, a liability that loyalty refused to jettison. The tactical plan was rudimentary: brute force, velocity, and the element of shock. They would exit the south doors of the stable, turning immediately toward the creek and the timberline. This route would take them across the field of fire commanded by the deputies positioned near the wagons and the general store. It was a gauntlet of approximately 100 yards of open terrain before the scrub oak offered concealment. To cross it, they had to move faster than the lawmen could track them. They checked their weapons. The rifles were holstered in the saddle scabbards or held across the pommels. Revolvers were drawn. They were not planning to aim. They were planning to suppress. They needed to create a wall of noise and lead that would force the deputies to keep their heads down for the 5 seconds it would take to clear the kill zone. Doolin swung into his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked at the other men. Dalton, Blake, and Clifton mounted up. The horses sensed the shift in tension. They bunched their muscles, hindquarters dropping slightly, ready to release the kinetic energy built up during the confinement. Doolin signaled with a sharp nod. Tulsa Jack rode to the large double doors at the rear of the stable. He leaned down, struggling with the iron latch bar for a split second before throwing it clear. He kicked the doors outward. The sudden influx of afternoon light was blinding after the gloom of the barn. The exit revealed the dusty alleyway and the stretch of Ash Street beyond. The moment the doors swung open, the deputies stationed near the wagon saw the movement. A shout went up from the perimeter. "They're breaking! The stable!" The warning was superfluous. The sound of the horses launching themselves from the barn was unmistakable, like a landslide beginning. The gang did not trot out. They erupted. The hooves tore into the earth, throwing clods of dirt and manure backward as the animals accelerated from a standstill to a full gallop in 3 strides. Doolin led the charge, dragging Newcomb's horse alongside him. They burst into the sunlight, a chaotic knot of riders and horseflesh. The sudden appearance of the targets shifted the entire focus of the battle. The deputies, who had been pinning down the hotel and the saloon, swung their weapons toward the stable exit with a unified motion. The air around the fleeing outlaws filled instantly with the supersonic snap of bullets. The lead slugs whined past their ears, sounding like angry insects. The ground around the horses' hooves erupted in small geysers of red dust as the rounds impacted the dirt, creating a localized dust storm that obscured the targets. Deputy John Hickson, Deputy Leif Shadley, and the others opened fire with everything they had. They worked the levers of their Winchesters frantically, expending ammunition without regard for conservation. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out the hoofbeats. The outlaws returned fire, shooting one-handed from the saddle. They fired wildly, their bullets smashing into the sides of the buildings, the wagons, and the dirt, forcing the deputies to flinch. It was a rolling, high-speed firefight, a blur of motion and smoke. The physics of the engagement were chaotic. Hitting a moving target from a moving platform was nearly impossible, but the volume of fire compensated for the lack of accuracy. As the gang turned the corner of the stable, heading for the wire fence that marked the edge of the town lots, they presented a flanking profile to the deputies. Deputy Leif Shadley, A man known for his tenacity and aggression saw the opportunity. He broke from his cover behind the picket fence. He ignored the suppression fire coming from Arkansas Tom in the hotel window, accepting the risk. Shadley's focus was entirely on the escaping fugitives. He ran into the open street, dropping to one knee to stabilize his aim. He tracked the riders, swinging the barrel of his rifle. He knew that hitting a man on a galloping horse at 50 yards was a low-percentage shot. He aimed for the larger targets. He aimed for the engine of the escape. He aimed for the horses. Shadley fired. The .44-40 bullet struck the horse ridden by Bill Dalton. The impact was audible, a wet, solid thud that rose above the gunfire. The horse, a sturdy gelding, stumbled mid-stride as the bullet shattered its shoulder blade. The animal's front legs collapsed under the momentum. The laws of physics took over. The horse flipped violently forward, its hindquarters coming over its head. Bill Dalton was thrown from the saddle with tremendous force. He hit the ground hard, rolling in the dust, his rifle flying from his grip and skittering away. The horse thrashed on the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust before shivering and lying still. The escape was disrupted. The gang was split. Doolin, Newcomb, Tulsa Jack, and Dynamite Dick were still mounted, tearing toward the fence line. Dalton was down, exposed in the middle of the street, winded and bruised, with a federal marshal drawing a bead on him. Shadley racked the lever of his rifle, ejecting the spent shell. It tumbled through the air, catching the sun. He had the outlaw dead to rights. He adjusted his aim, centering the sights on the man scrambling in the dirt. This was the moment of execution. But Bill Dalton was not incapacitated. He was dazed, covered in grit and shaken, but his survival instincts were intact. He saw Shadley kneeling in the street. He saw the black bore of the rifle leveled at him. Dalton did not reach for his fallen rifle. It was too far away. He drew his Colt single-action Army revolver from his hip holster while lying on his back. He did not stand up. He fired from the supine position, propping himself up on one elbow, steadying his aim against the ground. Simultaneously, Bill Doolin, seeing his lieutenant go down, checked his horse. He pulled hard on the reins, sliding the animal to a halt amidst the gunfire, the horse's hooves furrowing the ground. He turned in the saddle, raising his Winchester one-handed. He saw Shadley. He saw the threat. Doolin fired. The sequence of events occurred in less than 2 seconds. Shadley fired his second shot, but the aim was hurried by the incoming fire. The bullet kicked up dirt near Dalton's boots. Dalton's return fire, and possibly Doolin's covering shot, found their mark. A heavy-caliber bullet struck Deputy Leif Shadley in the upper torso. The force of the impact was tremendous. It lifted the lawman from his kneeling position and twisted his body backward. He dropped his rifle. He collapsed into the red dust of Ash Street, clutching his chest. The bright arterial blood began to stain his vest immediately, pooling rapidly under his body. With the immediate threat neutralized, Dalton scrambled to his feet. He was unhurt by the fall or the gunfire, seemingly protected by the chaos. He ran toward the others. Doolin reached down, offering an arm or a stirrup, shouting for Dalton to mount up behind him. But the fence was too close, and the horse was already carrying the weight of the drag. Dalton waved them on. He sprinted for the cover of the creek bed, moving with a desperate speed. He dove through the strands of the wire fence, tearing his coat on the barbs, and rolled into the high grass of the drainage ditch. He was footmobile now, but he was alive and out of the immediate kill zone. The remaining riders hit the wire fence at a full gallop. They did not stop to cut it. They did not look for a gate. The horses, fueled by terror and pain, crashed through the barbed wire. The sharp barbs tore into the animals' chests and legs and ripped at the outlaw's clothing, but the momentum carried them through. The fence posts snapped like dry twigs under the impact. The wire pinged and coiled back, singing through the air like a whip. They cleared the perimeter of Engles. leaving a trail of broken wood and blood on the wire. Once past the fence, the terrain dropped away into a series of ravines and timber stands. The outlaws spurred their mounts, driving them into the cover of the blackjack oaks. The leaves whipped against their faces, stinging their eyes. The sound of the gunfire from the town began to recede, replaced by the heavy breathing of the horses and the crashing of brush. They had run the gauntlet. They had absorbed the full weight of the federal posse's fire and broken through the encirclement. They were battered, one horse down, one man crippled, and another on foot, but they were free of the trap. Back on Ash Street, the dust began to settle over the scene of the charge. The body of Dalton's horse lay in the road, a dark mound in the sunlight, flanked by a stain of dark blood. Near the picket fence, Deputy Leif Shadley lay motionless. His breathing was shallow and ragged, a wet, rattling sound. The blood pooled beneath him, turning the dry Oklahoma earth into a dark mud. Other deputies, seeing him fall, shouted his name, but they could not reach him immediately. The sniper in the hotel, Arkansas Tom, was still active, firing sporadically to keep them pinned and prevent them from pursuing the fleeing gang. The escape of the main body of the gang left a vacuum in the battle. The noise level dropped perceptibly. The focus of the deputies shifted from the fleeing riders back to the immediate threats, the sniper and the dying deputy. Hickson crawled toward Shadley, risking exposure. He grabbed Shadley by the collar of his coat and dragged him back behind the cover of the wagon. Shadley groaned, his eyes unfocused. The wound was mortal. The bullet had done massive internal damage. There was nothing Hickson or the others could do but try to make him comfortable in the dirt, loosening his collar and shielding his eyes from the sun. The flight of the outlaws was a tactical masterstroke of brutality. They had used speed and violence of action to overcome a static siege. They had sacrificed a horse and taken a hit, but the core of the gang, Doolin, Newcomb, Blake, Clifton, and Dalton, had survived. They were now in their element, the rugged terrain where a horse and a rifle were worth more than a badge. They rode hard for the first mile, putting distance between themselves and the town. Doolin kept a tight hold on Newcomb's horse, the leather rein digging into his palm. The wounded man was barely conscious, swaying in the saddle, held upright only by grit and the balance of the animal. But he was still mounted. The deputies watched the dust cloud recede to the southwest. They fired a few long-range shots at the timberline, but it was a futile gesture. The targets were gone. The realization of the failure settled over the posse like a physical weight. They had trapped the gang, surprised them, and outgunned them, yet the outlaws had cut their way out. The cost of the engagement was now painfully clear. 2 deputies were down, 1 dead and 1 dying. The street was littered with brass, glass, and blood. The objective had been total capture or elimination, and they had achieved neither regarding the leadership of the gang. The confrontation between Shadley and the outlaws had been the climax of the street battle. It was a direct face-to-face duel in the middle of a war zone. Shadley had gambled his life to stop the escape, and he had lost. The image of the horse flipping and the outlaw rising from the dust to kill the lawman would be burned into the memories of the surviving deputies. It was a testament to the ferocity of the Doolin gang. They did not surrender. They did not hesitate. When cornered, they attacked with a savagery that the lawmen had underestimated. As the adrenaline faded, the physical reality of the exertion hit the men. Their hands shook uncontrollably, their throats were parched. The sun beat down on the dead horses and the ruined buildings. The smell of death was now a tangible part of the atmosphere. The gauntlet was empty save for the debris of the passage. The wire fence hung in tatters, a symbol of the breached perimeter. The battle was not over. Arkansas Tom was still in the hotel, but the primary objective had failed. The bird had flown the coop and the hawk lay dying in the dirt. The deputies checked their ammunition, their fingers fumbling with the cartridges. They looked at Shadley's pale face, watching the life fade from his eyes. A cold anger began to replace the combat anxiety. They turned their eyes back to the OK Hotel. One outlaw remained, one man to pay for the carnage in the street. The escape of Doolin and the others was a bitter defeat, but the Battle of Engles still had one final act to play out. The street was quiet again, but it was the silence of a graveyard. The running of the gauntlet was finished, and the toll had been collected in full. By 4 p.m., the dynamic of the Battle of Engles had undergone a fundamental contraction, shrinking from a sprawling, chaotic running gunfight across the prairie to a static, high-stakes siege focused on a single room. The escape of Bill Doolin and the main body of the gang into the timber of the Cimarron Breaks marked the end of the mobile phase of the engagement. The battlefield, which had encompassed the entire width of Ash Street, the livery stable, and the surrounding fields, was now defined by the four walls of the corner room on the second floor of the OK Hotel. Inside that room, Arkansas Tom Jones was no longer the Overwatch sniper protecting his Confederates. He was the sole focus of the federal government's vengeance. The 13 deputy marshals, diminished now by the loss of Dick Speed and Leif Shadley, turned their attention to the hotel with a cold, mechanical fury. The escape of the gang leaders was a professional failure, but the continued resistance of the gunmen in the hotel was a personal affront. Jones had killed Speed. Jones had pinned them down while the others fled. The deputies did not need orders from John Hickson to know what had to be done. They reorganized their line, moving from the defensive postures they had held during the breakout to aggressive siege positions. They surrounded the hotel on 3 sides, cutting off any potential escape route. Men positioned themselves behind the rain barrels, the corners of the general store, and the wreckage of the saloon, their rifles trained on the second-story windows. Inside the hotel room, the reality of the situation settled upon Arkansas Tom Jones with the weight of the humid afternoon air. The room, which had served as a sniper's nest, was now a prison cell. The air was unbreathable, thick with the gray smoke of black powder that hung in stagnant layers near the ceiling, trapped by the lack of a breeze. The floor was a carpet of debris, shattered glass from the windows, splintered wood from the walls, and the brass casings of the rounds he had fired. The furniture was wrecked. The iron bed frame was bent from bullet impacts, the mattress torn and spilling batting onto the floor. The wash basin was smashed, the ceramic shards scattered, the water having long since evaporated in the heat. Jones sat in the corner, protected by the angle of the walls, his chest heaving. He was drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to his skin like a second layer. His thirst was a physical pain, a dryness that made swallowing impossible. He checked his ammunition, his fingers fumbling with the cardboard box. The supply of 4440 cartridges was critically low. He had fired dozens of rounds covering the escape. He had a few rounds left in the magazine of his Winchester and the 6 rounds in his revolver. He looked out the jagged hole where the window had been. He saw the deputies moving below. They were not hiding anymore. They were preparing. He realized with a stark clarity that Doolin was not coming back. The gang had cut their losses. They had traded his position for their freedom. He was the loss. He was the price paid for the ticket out of Engles. The loyalty he had counted on had evaporated the moment they hit the tree line. Deputy Jim Masterson took charge of the physical assault on the hotel. He was a man of immense frontier experience, and he understood that rifle fire alone would not dig Jones out of his hole without risking more men. The walls of the hotel were thin, but the angles were tricky. They could shoot the building to pieces, but unless they scored a lucky hit, Jones could hold out until nightfall. And if night fell, he might slip away in the darkness. Masterson wanted a decisive end. He called for dynamite. The mention of explosives changed the texture of the standoff. The deputies located several sticks of dynamite, likely sourced from the same general store supplies the gang had used for their safe-cracking operations. Masterson handled the explosives with care. He bound the sticks together with friction tape, creating a charge capable of leveling the corner of the building or blowing the staircase apart. He attached a fuse, cutting it to a length that would give them time to throw it, but not enough time for Jones to throw it back. The plan was simple. If Jones would not come out, they would blow the foundation out from under him. The structure was wood. It would shatter and burn. Hickson approached the hotel, keeping close to the wall to stay out of the angle of fire from the upper window. He cupped his hands around his mouth. He did not offer a plea. He issued an ultimatum. He shouted up to the second floor, his voice raspy from the smoke and the shouting of the last 3 hours. He told Jones that the gang was gone. He told him that Speed was dead and Shadley was dying. He told him that they had dynamite and were preparing to level the building. "Come down now," Hickson shouted, his voice echoing off the false fronts of the stores, "or we blow you to hell." Jones heard the voice. It sounded distant, muffled by the ringing in his ears that had persisted since the shooting started. He looked at the Winchester in his hands. It was hot to the touch, the wood of the forestock scorched. He looked at the door of the room. He could try to run down the stairs, but he knew they would be waiting at the bottom. He could try to jump from the window, but the fall would break his legs and they would shoot him before he hit the ground. The threat of dynamite was not a bluff. He knew these men. They were past the point of caution. They wanted blood to balance the scales. The presence of civilians complicated the final assault. Mary Pierce, the owner of the hotel, was still huddled on the ground floor, likely in the kitchen or the cellar. Hickson knew this. He shouted again, warning Jones that there were women in the building. He placed the moral burden of their deaths on the outlaw. If Jones forced them to use the dynamite, he would be killing the people who had sheltered him. This psychological lever was applied with precision. Jones was a killer, but the code of the outlaw often drew a line at involving non-combatants directly in their own destruction. The deputies used this, knowing that Jones considered himself a man of some honor. Jones crawled to the window, staying low to avoid presenting a silhouette. He shouted back. He asked for terms. He wanted to know if he would be shot on sight if he surrendered. The fear of a summary execution was valid. He had killed a deputy. In the heat of the moment, surrendering might just be a slower way of dying. Masterson shouted back, his voice hard and uncompromising. He promised that if Jones came out unarmed, with his hands up, he would not be killed in the street. He promised him a trial. It was the only offer on the table. "Walk out or burn," Masterson added, lighting a match and holding it near the fuse to show he was serious. Inside the room, Jones weighed the options. He looked at the dynamite charge visible in Masterson's hand below. He looked at the sun, which was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the wrecked room. He was 23 years old. He was not ready to die in a pile of burning lumber. The bravado of the standoff had evaporated, replaced by the biological imperative to survive. He stood up slowly, his knees shaking from fatigue. He kept his hands away from his guns. He walked to the window. He yelled down that he was coming out. He asked the deputies to hold their fire. The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. The birds, which had fled hours ago, had not returned. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the siding and the groaning of the wounded building. Jones picked up his Winchester. He held it by the barrel. He tossed it out the window. The rifle cartwheeled through the air, hitting the dirt of the street with a clatter. Next, he unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather, weighted down by the revolver and the remaining cartridges, fell with a solid thud. Jones walked to the door of the room. He opened it. The hallway was dark and quiet. He walked to the top of the stairs. He could see the deputies waiting at the bottom, their guns raised, the barrels dark circles in the gloom. He raised his hands above his head, palms open. He walked down the stairs slowly, each step creaking in the silence. His face was streaked with soot and blood from the graze on his cheek. His clothes were torn and covered in plaster dust. He looked like a man who had walked out of a collapsed mine, a specter of the violence he had unleashed. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, the deputies swarmed him. They did not beat him, but they handled him with a rough, professional efficiency. They spun him around, pulling his arms behind his back. The handcuffs clicked shut, the metal biting into his wrists. Hickson grabbed him by the shoulder and marched him out onto the porch of the hotel. The physical contact was aggressive, a release of the tension the lawman had carried for hours. The transition from the dark interior to the bright sunlight of the late afternoon was jarring. Jones blinked against the glare. He looked out at the street. The first thing he saw was the body of Dick Speed. The deputy lay where he had fallen, covered now by a blanket, but the shape was unmistakable. Further down, near the wagon, lay Leif Shadley, who had succumbed to his wounds minutes before. The cost of the day was laid out in front of him. Jones looked at the faces of the marshals. They were grim, tight-lipped, their eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hatred. They had captured the sniper, but they had lost two of their own. It was a poor exchange. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They stepped out onto the boardwalks, looking at the destruction. The saloon was a wreck, daylight visible through the walls. The hotel was riddled with holes. Dead horses lay in the street, attracting flies. The air smelled of death and gunpowder. They looked at Arkansas Tom Jones, the dapper young man who had lived among them for months, who had bought candy for their children and flirted with the local girls. Now he was a prisoner, bound and defeated. The illusion of the noble outlaw was shattered by the reality of the bodies in the dirt. He was just a dirty, frightened kid in handcuffs. Hickson ordered Jones to be taken to a secure location. They did not have a jail in Engles strong enough to hold him, so they placed him in one of the wagons, chaining him to the iron supports. A deputy sat opposite him with a shotgun across his knees, his finger resting on the trigger guard. Jones sat on the floor of the wagon, his head down. He did not speak. He did not ask about Doolin. He knew the answer. They were free and he was in chains. The betrayal stung more than the handcuffs. The deputies began the grim task of processing the scene. They collected the weapons of the fallen officers. They gathered the personal effects from the saddlebags of the dead outlaws' horses. They documented the damage to the buildings. Dr. Pickering moved among the wounded, checking the minor injuries of the bystanders and the deputies. He confirmed the deaths of Speed and Shadley. He covered their faces. The permanence of the event settled over the town. Ingalls would never be the same. It was no longer just a town. It was a battlefield memorial. Masterson walked over to the spot where Speed had died. He looked at the angle from the hotel window. It was a difficult shot. Jones was a marksman. Masterson spat into the dust. He knew that if they had hesitated with the dynamite, more men would have died. The decision to escalate had forced the surrender. It was the only way to break the deadlock. The visual of the dynamite fuse had been the turning point. Fear had done what bullets could not. As the sun began to set, turning the sky a bruised purple, the temperature dropped. The adrenaline that had sustained the men for hours crashed, leaving them shaking with fatigue. They drank water from the well, splashing it over their faces to wash away the grime. They ate dried beef and biscuits, the food tasting like dust. They looked at the captured outlaw in the wagon. Jones was staring at the floorboards. He was alive, but his life as a free man was over. The long drop of a hangman's noose or the stone walls of a federal penitentiary awaited him. Mary Pierce stood on the porch of her ruined hotel. She looked at the shattered windows and the holes in the siding. She looked at the deputies loading the bodies of their comrades. She realized that the economic boom brought by the gang was over. The silver dollars were gone, replaced by lead. The town was broken, the sanctuary was violated. The Marshals had won the ground, but at a terrible price. The Battle of Engles was effectively over. The shooting had stopped, the smoke had cleared. But the narrative of the day was still being written in the minds of the men who had survived it. Hickson looked at the map in his pocket. He thought about the telegram he would have to send to Marshal Nix in Guthrie. Engage Doolin gang at Ingalls. Doolin escaped, Speed and Shadley killed, captured Arkansas Tom. It was a telegram of mixed news. A tactical failure to capture the leader, a strategic victory in breaking the sanctuary, and a heavy cost in blood. The last stand of Arkansas. Tom had not been a heroic defense. It had been a desperate delaying action that ended in a calculated surrender. He had bought time for his friends with the lives of his enemies, and when the bill came due, he had folded. The deputies hitched up the teams to the wagons. The horses, tired and skittish, snorted in the cooling air. The convoy prepared to move out. They would not stay in Engles tonight. The town felt hostile, a place of betrayal and ambush. They would take their prisoner and their dead back to the civilized world. As the wagons rolled out of town, heading west toward Stillwater, Jones looked back at the hotel. The window he had fired from was a black square against the white siding. It looked like an empty eye socket staring blindly at the street. He turned away. The road ahead was long and dark. The battle was history now. The consequences were just beginning. The silence of the prairie swallowed the convoy, leaving Engles to reckon with its ghosts in the gathering dark. September 1st, 1893 bled agonizingly into the darkness of September 2nd as the convoy of two covered wagons moved slowly westward along the rutted road toward Stillwater. The adrenaline that had sustained the 13 deputy marshals during the violent intensity of the firefight had completely dissipated, replaced by a crushing leaden fatigue that settled into the marrow of their bones. The wagons, which hours earlier had served as a Trojan horse to infiltrate the outlaw sanctuary, were now hearses. In the lead wagon, the body of Deputy Dick Speed lay wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, the fabric already stiffening with dried blood where it pressed against the wood. Beside him lay Deputy Leif Shadley, who had collapsed to the massive chest wound inflicted by Bill Dalton just as the wagons cleared the town limits of Engles. The third casualty, Deputy Thomas Houston, lay on a makeshift pallet of straw, drifting in and out of a delirium induced by shock and blood loss. His breathing shallow and wet as his body fought a losing battle against the abdominal trauma caused by Arkansas Tom's rifle slug. The journey was a grueling ordeal of physical endurance. The night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the baking heat of the afternoon, but inside the canvas covers the atmosphere was dense and biological, a mixture of stale sweat, gun oil, unwashed bodies, and the distinct metallic scent of open wounds. The wagons possessed no suspension springs to speak of, and every jolt from the uneven road transferred directly through the iron tires and wooden axles to the passengers. For the uninjured deputies, it was uncomfortable. For Thomas Houston, it was torture. Every lurch of the wheels elicited a low, involuntary moan from the dying man, a sound that cut through the silence of the prairie and settled into the minds of the men who had failed to protect him. Deputy John Hickson sat near the tailgate, his eyes red-rimmed and staring into the dark. He held a canteen, occasionally wetting Houston's lips with a rag, but there was little else he could do. The medical supplies they carried were insufficient for gut-shot wounds. They were transporting a dead man who simply hadn't stopped breathing yet. Arkansas Tom Jones sat chained to the iron supports of the second wagon. He was the only prisoner, the sole trophy of the operation that had cost so much. He sat with his knees drawn up, his wrists manacled with heavy irons, watching the deputies with a guarded, flat expression. He did not speak. The bravado of the hotel sniper was gone, stripped away by the reality of his capture and the physical proximity of the men he had killed. A deputy sat directly across from him, a double-barreled shotgun resting across his lap, the twin barrels pointed steadily at Jones's chest. The deputy's finger never left the trigger guard. There was no conversation. The animosity in the confined space was palpable, a physical pressure that filled the wagon. Jones knew that if the wagon hit a deep rut and the gun went off, it would be written up as an accident, and no jury in the Oklahoma Territory would convict the lawman. He sat perfectly still, absorbing the vibration of the road, a living artifact of the battle surrounded by its victims. The convoy reached the outskirts of Stillwater in the pre-dawn hours of September 2nd. The town was asleep, the streets empty and silent, the windows of the houses dark. The arrival was not a triumphant parade. It was a grim logistical operation carried out in the shadows. They pulled the wagons up to the rear of the undertaking parlor. Hickson woke the undertaker, a man accustomed to the violent mortality rate of the territory, who appeared in his nightshirt holding a kerosene lantern. The yellow light from the lamp cast long, swinging shadows against the brick wall of the building as the deputies unloaded their burden. They lifted the stiffening bodies of Speed and Shadley with a respectful solemnity, the dead weight heavy in their arms. They carried them into the cool back room, laying them out on the wooden preparation tables. The blankets were pulled back, revealing the brutality of the large caliber wounds. The undertaker measured the bodies for pine coffins, jotting down numbers in a ledger with a pencil that scratched loudly in the quiet room. Houston was transported immediately to a local boarding house where a bed had been prepared. A local doctor was summoned from his sleep. The physician arrived quickly, his face grave as he examined the abdominal wound. He cleaned the entry site and administered morphine to dull the pain, but his examination was brief. He looked at Hickson and shook his head. The bullet had done too much damage to the internal organs. Peritonitis and shock were already setting in. There was no surgery that could save him in 1893. Houston was placed in the clean bed, the sheets crisp and white, a stark contrast to the blood-stained straw of the wagon. The deputies took turns sitting by his bedside, watching the erratic rise and fall of his chest, waiting for the inevitable end. The cost of justice was being tallied in real time, measured in the slow, fading pulse of a veteran lawman. While the deputies in Stillwater tended to their dead, the town of Engles woke to a morning of reckoning. The sun rose on September 2nd to reveal a settlement that had been physically and economically shattered. The illusion of the peaceful coexistence between the outlaws and the citizens was gone, replaced by the jagged reality of destruction. Mary Pierce stood in the street looking up at the facade of the OK Hotel. The building was a ruin. The siding was perforated by hundreds of bullet holes resembling a piece of lace held up to the light. The windows were gaping maws, the glass pulverized into the dirt of the street. Inside, the furniture was kindling. The mirrors, the bedding, the washstands, everything on the second floor was destroyed. Her livelihood had been dismantled in an afternoon. She picked up a piece of brass casing from the boardwalk, turning it over in her hand, a small, heavy souvenir of the disaster. The rest of the town fared little better. The Trigg and Ransom saloon was a shell. The interior was wrecked, the stock of liquor destroyed, the bar scarred by lead. The livery stable stood with its doors hanging off the hinges, the stalls empty of the high-dollar horses that had brought in steady revenue. The carcasses of the 3 horses killed in the street, 2 belonging to the gang and 1 to a deputy, had bloated in the night. The smell was overpowering, a thick, sweet stench of decay that attracted swarms of blowflies buzzing in black clouds. The town council, such as it was, organized a work detail to drag the dead animals to a ravine outside of town. Chains were attached to the stiff legs of the horses, and teams of mules dragged them through the dust, leaving wide furrows in the road. They piled brush and coal oil on the carcasses and set them alight. The smoke from the pyres rose into the sky, a greasy black signal that marked the end of the Doolin era in Engles. Dr. Pickering moved through the town, checking on the civilians. Remarkably, despite the volume of fire, the collateral damage to human life had been minimal among the residents. A few cuts from flying glass, a few bruises from diving for cover, but no funerals for the townspeople. However, the psychological damage was absolute. The residents realized that their protectors had used them as human shields. Doolin and his men had drawn the fire, and when the heat became too intense, they had fled, leaving the town to face the wrath of the federal government alone. The stream of silver dollars that had kept the local economy afloat was severed. The merchants looked at their empty shelves and ruined storefronts and understood that the boom times were over. Engles would now be known not as a sanctuary but as a battlefield. Back in Stillwater, Hickson went to the telegraph office as soon as it opened. He composed the message to Marshal Evet Dumas Nix in Guthrie. He did not use flowery language or attempt to soften the blow. He reported the facts. The engagement had occurred. The gang had been routed from their position. Doolin-Dalton, Newcomb, and the others had escaped into the timber. Arkansas Tom Jones was in custody. Deputies Speed and Shadley were dead. Deputy Houston was critical. The telegraph key clicked rapidly, sending the electrical impulses down the wire, carrying the weight of the failure and the tragedy to the territorial capital. Hickson watched the operator tap out the message, his face set in a grim line. He knew the questions that would follow. He knew the criticism that would come from the newspapers. They had surprised the gang. They had outnumbered them. And yet the leaders had slipped away. The reaction in Guthrie was immediate and explosive. Marshal Nix received the telegram in his office. He read it twice, his face paling as he reached the names of the dead. These were men he had recruited, men he had personally asked to ride into the line of fire. He famously wept upon receiving the news, the emotional toll of his command breaking through his professional exterior. But the grief quickly hardened into resolve. He immediately ordered preparations for a state funeral. He contacted the families of the fallen deputies, a task that required a reserve of strength he had to summon from the depths of his character. The three guardsmen, Bill Tilghman, Heck Thomas, and Chris Madsen, were summoned to the office. The rules of engagement had changed. The pursuit of the Doolin gang would no longer be a standard law enforcement operation. It would be a total war of attrition. On September 2nd, Deputy Thomas Houston died in the boarding house in Stillwater, his fight ending in the quiet room. His body was prepared and joined the others at the undertaking parlor. The coffins of Speed, Shadley, and Houston were loaded onto a train for the final leg of the journey to Guthrie. The train car carrying the three caskets was draped in black bunting. As the locomotive steamed into the Guthrie station, a massive crowd had gathered. They stood in silence, hats in hands, watching the steam engine hiss to a halt. The coffins were offloaded by an honor guard of deputies, their badges shrouded in black crepe. The wooden boxes were simple, but the weight they carried was the heavy price of bringing law to the Cherokee outlet. Arkansas Tom Jones was transported in a separate car, heavily guarded by men who would have happily killed him if he gave them an excuse. He was marched through the station, chains rattling on the platform, surrounded by deputies who looked at the crowd with hard, warning eyes. The public looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. He was the tangible focal point for their anger. He was the man who had pulled the trigger. He was taken to the federal jail, a stone fortress that offered no view of the street. As the heavy steel cell door slammed shut, the reality of his future locked into place. He would face trial, and the testimony of 13 marshals would ensure he never saw the outside of a prison again. He sat on the bunk, listening to the distant sounds of the city, a man isolated by his own actions. The funerals for the deputies were the largest the territory had ever seen. The caskets were laid out in the territorial building, surrounded by floral wreaths. Flags were draped over them. Politicians gave speeches about sacrifice and the taming of the frontier. They spoke of civilization and the rule of law. But the deputies standing in the back of the room, the men who had crouched in the dust of Ash Street and felt the heat of the burning saloon, heard the words through a different filter. They knew the chaotic, dirty reality of the fight. They knew that Speed and Shadley had not died for abstract concepts. They had died because a bullet is faster than a man, and because the terrain of Engles favored the wicked. They stood stiffly in their Sunday suits, uncomfortable in the formal setting, their minds still replaying the sounds of the Winchester rifles. The legacy of the Battle of Engles solidified in the weeks that followed. The Doolin gang, though they had escaped, was broken as a cohesive unit. The sanctuary of Engles was gone forever. They could no longer rest openly in towns or rely on the support of an entire community. They were forced into the deep wilderness, hunted relentlessly by the reorganized and motivated marshals. The loss of their base of operations disrupted their logistics. They became desperate, their robberies more erratic and less profitable. The battle had proven that the federal government was willing to escalate the violence to match the outlaws. It was a turning point. The romanticism of the wild bunch was eroding under the pressure of modern, organized law enforcement. In Engles, the physical scars of the battle remained visible for decades. The bullet holes in the OK Hotel were never fully repaired. They became scars of history pointed out to strangers by the few people who remained. The town never recovered its economic vitality. It faded back into obscurity, a small farming community haunted by a single afternoon of extreme violence. The residents who lived through it spoke of the noise and the smoke for the rest of their lives. They remembered the day the war came to their doorstep and left nothing but ruin. The saloon was never rebuilt to its former glory. The livery stable eventually collapsed from neglect. The cost of justice was a ledger balanced in blood. 3 lawmen were dead, several outlaws were wounded, a town was ruined, a young man was in chains for life. The Doolin gang had been dislodged, but they were still free to kill again. For Marshal Nix, the victory was hollow. He sat in his office, looking at the map where the dot of Engles seemed to burn a hole in the paper. He knew that the war was not over. The Battle of Engles was just the opening salvo in a long, bloody campaign. But the price had been set. The territory would be tamed no matter how many coffins had to be filled to do it. The era of the outlaw fortress was over, dismantled by the sheer brute force of the inevitable future.